I built my cabin in a remote area, far enough from civilization that I could enjoy some solitude, but close enough to be able to grab essentials whenever I needed to. It wasn't much, just a small, wood-frame structure with a porch that overlooked a small creek. The sound of the water trickling by was calming, and the scent of pine trees filled the air. I'd been working on it for a couple of months, spending weekends out there, gathering wood, and piecing things together. There wasn't anyone nearby, just a few distant neighbors scattered over miles of forest. The first night I stayed in the cabin, it was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your ears. The wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the occasional animal scurrying in the underbrush. I didn't have much of a plan for the evening, just some canned food, a couple of beers, and a cheap flashlight. The only thing I could hear was the crackling of the fire in the small wood stove I'd set up in the center of the cabin. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not in a way that I could put my finger on, just a vague unease that had settled into my bones. The place felt off, like the trees outside were watching me. The longer I sat in the cabin, the more I felt like I was intruding, like I didn't belong in this place. It was ridiculous I'd built the damn thing, but every creak of the wood, every groan of the floorboards, made my nerves tighten. I spent the night alone, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of the wood in the stove or the distant howling of a coyote. I tried to sleep, but the quiet was unbearable. It wasn't the kind of quiet I was used to. It was too still, too thick. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh pine in the air. The sun was peeking through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I stepped outside onto the porch, feeling the chill of the morning air on my skin. Everything was calm, peaceful even. The worries from the night before seemed silly in the light of day. I spent the day working on the cabin, fixing up the roof and setting up a small garden by the side. As I worked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. There were no birds chirping, no rustling in the bushes. It was like the entire world had gone still. The only sounds came from the distant creek, but even it seemed muffled, like the trees were absorbing everything. That evening, I decided to try and sleep in the cabin again. I had set up the bed in one of the back rooms, away from the door, hoping it would be warmer and more secluded. The wind outside had picked up, making the trees sway and groan under the pressure. I lay there in the darkness, the faint sounds of the wind mixing with the occasional creaks of the building settling. But this time, it wasn't just the wind I heard. There was something else. A noise, faint at first, but growing louder. It sounded like a twig snapping, then another, then more, faster, like something was moving through the brush just outside my cabin. My heart rate picked up. It was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the way the noise came closer made me freeze. The sound wasn't natural, not like any animal I'd heard before. It was deliberate, like something was trying to be quiet but couldn't help making noise. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I lay still, straining my ears to hear better. The noise stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything went quiet again. I let out a breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard a soft knock on the cabin door. I froze. My first thought was that it was someone playing a prank, maybe one of the neighbors. But who would come out here at night? And why would they knock? The knock came again, this time louder, more urgent. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Should I get up and look? Should I call out? I considered going to the window, but the thought of opening it to whatever was outside made my stomach turn. There was no way I could pretend it was nothing. Felt too real, too close. I decided to get up, slowly. Every step I took toward the door felt heavier than the last. My hands were shaking, but I still reached for the handle. I opened it a crack, just enough to peek outside. There was nothing, no one. I stepped outside, my heart racing. The porch was dark, but I could make out the silhouette of the trees against the night sky. Everything looked still, quiet. I was about to step back inside when I heard it. This time it was coming from the woods, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A rustling, a shuffle of feet. Something large. It was moving fast, but not in a hurry, like it knew it was being heard. I didn't wait to see what it was. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in quick gasps. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and pointed it at the windows, sweeping the beam across the darkened woods. My pulse was hammering in my chest. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the cabin seemed amplified in the dark. The wind was louder now, howling through the trees like a low, constant moan. At some point, I heard the faintest sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Slowly at first, then faster, then slower again. But the steps never came closer. They just circled, as if whatever was out there was just waiting. Eventually, I drifted off, not from exhaustion, but from a sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I woke up with the first light of morning, the sunlight streaming in through the cracks in the cabin walls. The next day, I did everything I could to ignore the feeling that had settled into my chest. I spent the day outside, chopping firewood and clearing the brush around the cabin. It felt like there was no escape from the tension that had settled into the air. The woods around me felt dense, oppressive. Every rustling of the leaves, every movement in the underbrush made my heart skip a beat. That night, I decided to stay inside, to lock all the doors and windows and just sleep. It was foolish, I knew, but I couldn't keep living like this. I needed rest. I was halfway to sleep when I heard it again. The knocks, soft at first, then louder. And this time, they weren't coming from the door. They were coming from the walls. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest, listening. The knocks were rhythmic, like someone was tapping a finger against the wood. I stood, my legs shaky, and grabbed the flashlight. I swung the beam around the room, searching for something, anything, and then I saw it. On the floor, near the corner, was a small, fresh patch of dirt, soil that didn't belong there. Something had dug into the earth, leaving a hole in the corner of the cabin. My pulse raced, and I stepped back, my hand gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles were white. The digging had been recent. The soil was still soft, fresh. I could feel my chest tightening, the air growing colder. I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer alone. The knocks had been a warning, a message. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. My buddy and I had planned this camping trip for months. We were both looking for a break from the daily grind, a place to unplug and breathe. So we rented this small, rustic cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The kind of place where the phone signal barely existed, and the only noises were the wind, birds, and whatever critters lived around us. It was peaceful, or at least it seemed that way at first. We drove up late Friday afternoon, right when the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was old, but charming. It had a wooden porch that wrapped around most of the front, a small stone chimney, and windows that overlooked a thick forest. It looked exactly like what we had in mind, a perfect escape. The place was isolated, which was part of the appeal, but also why we felt a little on edge as we unloaded the car. We weren't scared, but there was a quiet sense of unease that settled in as we made our way inside. We spent the first few hours getting settled, unpacking our gear, and setting up a small fire pit outside. We joked about how remote the place was and how the only company we had were the squirrels and birds. We didn't really talk about how it felt a bit too quiet. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun was gone, and the woods around us were swallowed by darkness. The air grew colder as night fell. It wasn't freezing, but there was a definite chill, and the wind picked up a little, sending the sound of rustling leaves through the trees. We were sitting around the fire, not doing much, just taking in the night. The only other light came from the stars above and the flickering flames in front of us. We talked about random things, but I noticed how the woods felt different than what I was used to. Most forests have their sounds, their rhythms. This one felt oddly still, almost too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I shrugged it off, just my mind playing tricks, probably. As the night wore on, I started hearing things from the woods. Small noises at first, like branches cracking underfoot or the occasional rustle of leaves. But there was something off about them, like they were too deliberate, almost as if something was moving on purpose, creeping around the edge of the trees, staying just out of sight. I wasn't sure if my mind was just getting the best of me, but every now and then, I'd look into the dark forest, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing, just the shadows. My friend didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the fire, roasting marshmallows, his back to the woods. I stayed quiet, not wanting to freak him out, but every time the wind shifted, I felt like something was watching us. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. We couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet of the night was a little unsettling, but we figured we'd both feel better in the morning. The cabin was old, with creaky floors and heavy wooden beams overhead. The interior had that musty, lived-in smell. We made ourselves comfortable, each taking a bed on opposite sides of the room, our gear stacked up by the walls. I didn't really want to go to sleep, but the exhaustion from the drive and the day's activities made my eyes heavy. That's when it happened. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but I woke up to a noise, a soft, almost inaudible scratching sound coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or some small creature moving around. But then it came again, louder this time, like something dragging along the wooden walls of the cabin. The scratching was slow and deliberate, like whatever it was knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't a random animal scurrying about. It was methodical, as if something was inspecting the cabin. I lay there, frozen, listening. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound came from the porch, right outside the window by my bed. The window was cracked slightly open for ventilation, and I could hear it as clear as day. It stopped for a moment, and I almost thought it was over, but then a heavy thud hit the wall, followed by more dragging, this time louder, as if something had shifted its weight. I quickly pulled the covers over my head, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a bear or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The movement outside was too deliberate, too heavy. Whatever it wasn't just searching for food. Then came the worst part. I heard something breathing. It wasn't the normal snuffing of an animal sniffing around. It was slow, deliberate, almost like a wheeze. Deep, labored, with long gaps in between each breath. And it was close, really close. I could almost feel the air moving outside the window. I stayed perfectly still, hoping that whatever it was would move on. But it didn't. The breathing continued. The scratching started again, but now it was followed by another heavy thud. This time, the thud was so loud, it shook the walls of the cabin. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream for my friend, but I didn't want to alert whatever was outside that we were awake. The other part of me wanted to grab a weapon, but I didn't even know where to start looking. I wasn't sure if anything I had would do much against whatever was out there. I tried to peer through the small crack in the window, but the darkness outside was too thick, and I couldn't see anything. Minutes passed, maybe longer, but the sounds continued. Felt like an eternity. The only thing I could hear was the breathing, the scratching, and the occasional thud against the cabin. My mind raced, and I realized I was hyper-aware of everything. The rustling of the trees outside, the faint creak of the cabin shifting in the wind. But then the sound stopped. For a moment, everything was dead silent. Not even the wind moved through the trees. I waited, holding my breath, listening. I heard nothing. That's when I felt it. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been outside the cabin was now inside. I couldn't hear any footsteps, but something was definitely there. Something had moved. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then, I heard a shift of weight near the door, followed by a wet, dragging sound across the floor. It was slow, almost like the thing was dragging itself. Then the unmistakable sound of nails clicking against wood. It wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't a bear. Whatever it was bigger and far more dangerous. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My entire body tensed. The creature was close, so close, I could feel its presence. The wet, dragging sound came again, followed by a soft scrape of something against the wall. Then it stopped. I didn't move. Couldn't. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped completely. I lay there in the dark, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, hours maybe. But eventually, the light of dawn started to creep through the window. When I could finally bring myself to move, I crawled out of bed as quietly as possible. I didn't want to make a sound, afraid that whatever was out there might still be watching. I moved cautiously to the window. The porch outside was empty, but there was a trail of wet marks leading to the door. Something had dragged itself right up to the cabin. I didn't wake my friend. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, or if he'd even believe me, but we packed up our things as quickly as we could and left. I didn't care about our reservations or the trip anymore. The place felt wrong, tainted by whatever had been out there in the night. It wasn't just an animal. It was something else. We didn't talk about it on the way home. I don't think either of us knew how to begin, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been in those woods wasn't just looking for food. It was hunting. The worst part, I never saw it. I didn't have to. I could feel it. I still feel it sometimes. That presence, creeping around the edges of my mind. It's been years now, but I'll never forget the way it felt. Like something was watching, waiting, and listening. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway. A way to get away from the city, from everything that felt like it was closing in. I'd been feeling suffocated for months. Work, responsibilities, the noise, the constant reminders that life wasn't slowing down. And no matter how hard I tried, I could never keep up. So when the opportunity came to take my family out to a cabin in the woods for a few days, I jumped at it. The place was old, tucked away deep enough in the woods to make you feel like you were miles from anyone. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees, dirt roads, and the occasional wildlife that wandered by. It was quiet, peaceful, at least on the surface. I rented it online, read some reviews, mostly positive, but it was an older cabin, the kind that creaked in the wind and had more character than comfort. No big deal. We packed up, took the long drive, and made our way there with no real expectations, just the hope for a break. I got there first, alone. The roads had been narrow, winding, the kind that you could only take slow. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had just started to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was nestled in the middle of an overgrown lot, surrounded by tall pines that looked almost ancient. The roof had patches of moss, the wooden siding had started to peel away in places, and there was a rusted-out old swing hanging from a tree out front, barely still intact. The place was run down, but it had character. Felt like it had seen a lot over the years. It wasn't the kind of place I'd normally rent, but there was something about it that made me want to give it a shot. Plus, it was cheap, and the pictures online had looked decent enough. I got the keys from the caretaker, a grumpy older man with a weathered face who seemed to have seen more than his share of bad weather, and told me a few rules. Nothing major. Lock up when you leave. Keep the fire going if it gets cold. No loud noises at night. He mentioned something about the property being off the beaten path, and that I should keep an eye out for wildlife, but I didn't think much of it. I'd barely unpacked before my wife and kids showed up. I was glad they were finally there. Being alone out here had started to feel a little unsettling. It was just the quiet, the kind that felt unnatural. You know the type, the kind that presses in on you until it's all you can hear. We spent the first evening getting settled, cooking a simple dinner, unpacking our bags, and getting a fire going in the old wood stove. The place smelled like dust and old pine. We laughed, joked about how the cabin was falling apart, and had a good time. But when the sun finally set and the fire dimmed, the place felt different. Not in a bad way, but the silence was thick. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I brushed it off, probably just nerves from the drive. After all, it was a cabin in the woods. It wasn't going to be like home. The next morning, I woke up early. The kids were still asleep, and my wife was still in bed. I decided to step outside for a bit, to breathe in the morning air, maybe take a walk around the property. The forest looked still, almost too still. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the sky was pale blue, and the fog that often lingered in the mornings was starting to lift. It was cool, crisp, with the scent of pine and earth. As I walked around the cabin, I noticed a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. It wasn't really a trail, more like a path worn into the earth, hidden beneath the underbrush. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it, thinking I'd get a better sense of the area, maybe spot some wildlife. I walked for a while, probably an hour or more, until I started to feel like I had gone too far. The trees were dense, and the path was getting harder to follow. It twisted and turned, and I found myself craning my neck, trying to see what was ahead through the thick brush. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but when I got closer, I saw it was a body. It was a man, lying face down, half hidden beneath the leaves and pine needles. First, I froze. I didn't know what to think. I was too far in the woods to call anyone for help, and the reality of what I was seeing hit me slowly, like the weight of a stone sinking in water. The man's body was bloated and discolored, his clothes tattered and torn. His face was hidden, but the rest of him was exposed enough for me to see the long, ugly gashes along his arms and legs, like something or someone had dragged him through the forest. I didn't touch him. I didn't even want to get any closer, but I couldn't look away. There was something about the scene that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the body, it was the silence, the stillness of it all. Nothing moved. There wasn't even the sound of birds. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I turned back around and made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, trying not to panic. I don't know why, but I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to get anyone else involved. It was like the whole thing was too strange to explain, like if I mentioned it out loud, it would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. The rest of the day went by in a blur. I tried to shake the image of the body from my mind, but it stuck with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. When night came, I kept the fire burning a little brighter, a little hotter. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. People get lost all the time. The body could have been there for days, weeks even. It didn't mean anything, but something about it felt deliberate, like it had been placed there for a reason. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the woods outside. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak and groan. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig, like something was moving out there. But it wasn't animals. It didn't sound like anything natural. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't place what it was. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back and see the body again. I had to know. So, I grabbed my backpack, slipped out of the cabin while everyone was still asleep, and followed the trail back into the woods. When I got to where I'd found the man, I couldn't believe my eyes. The body was gone, completely gone. No trace of him, no blood, no clothing, nothing. The ground was disturbed, but it didn't make sense. How could someone or something take a body like that? I walked around in circles, my head spinning. There were no other footprints, no signs of struggle. It was like the whole thing had been a bad dream. But I knew what I had seen. I had seen him. I didn't tell my wife, not then. I just went back to the cabin, packed up everything as quickly as I could, and we left. I didn't say a word, and neither did she. It wasn't until a year later that I heard the news. A man had gone missing near those woods. His body had never been found. The authorities had no leads, no suspects. It was just one of those things that happened in the woods. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. And I'll never forget the feeling of finding that man in the woods. The way the air seemed to press in on me, like the forest itself was watching. Sometimes I think about what happened to him. Sometimes I wonder if the forest keeps its secrets for a reason. But I never told anyone, never mentioned it again. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a break from the noise of the city, a few days in a remote cabin tucked away in the woods. I had been feeling a little too stressed at work, and the quiet seemed like just what I needed. My plans were simple. Read a book, relax by the fire, maybe take a walk in the woods. No distractions, no commitments. Just me, the woods, and the cabin. I had rented the cabin from a friend of a friend. It was located on a secluded property deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. There was no cell service and no one else for miles. Perfect for getting away from it all. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The drive-in had been smooth, and the cabin looked exactly as it had in the pictures. Small, rustic, and surrounded by towering pine trees. The kind of place where you'd expect to hear the wind howling through the branches at night. I unpacked my things quickly, trying not to think too much about how isolated I was. The cabin had a wood-burning stove, a cozy living room with a big armchair, and a small kitchen. The bathroom was down the hall, and the bedroom had a large window that looked out into the forest. I liked the thought of being able to wake up to that view, with nothing but trees and sky in sight. As the evening wore on, I settled in, making myself a cup of tea and reading for a while. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the crackle of the fire in the stove. I remember feeling at peace for the first time in a long while. The silence was almost too quiet, but in a good way. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how much noise there is in your life when you're surrounded by people and technology all the time. After a while, I put the book down and decided to take a walk around the property. It was already dark outside, but the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I walked along a narrow path that led into the woods, the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound. There was something oddly calming about the solitude, though a small part of me was aware of how alone I was out there. But I brushed that feeling off. It was probably just nerves from the long drive. As I walked, I noticed a faint rustling in the bushes up ahead. I paused, listening. It was probably just a small animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound felt different somehow. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like something was trying to remain unnoticed. I stood still for a moment, staring into the darkness, trying to see if I could spot anything. But there was nothing, just the sound of wind moving through the branches. I shook my head, telling myself I was overthinking things. There were plenty of animals out here, and this was their territory, not mine. I turned around and headed back to the cabin, but the unease I felt didn't go away. It clung to me, a shadow following just a little too closely. Back inside, I locked the door behind me and threw another log on the fire. The warmth of the flames helped ease my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself by reading again, but I kept hearing things. A creak from the floor above, a slight rustle outside the window. Each noise made me tense, but I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind, or an animal moving around. The night passed without incident, but when I woke up the next morning, I felt restless. I couldn't put my finger on why, but something about the woods felt different now. The air felt heavier, and the silence seemed too thick, too suffocating. I spent most of the day inside, keeping myself busy with little tasks. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That evening, I decided to take another walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The woods looked different in the fading light, shadows stretching long across the ground. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I walked along the same path I had taken the night before, I noticed something strange. The bushes where I had heard the rustling the night before were still disturbed, but now they were even more so, as if something had been moving around there more recently. I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a sense of dread creeping up on me, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I glanced around, my breath catching in my throat. The silence was too perfect, the kind of silence that comes just before something happens. A twig snapped in the distance, and I whipped my head around, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing but the trees and the fading light. My hands were clammy, and my heart was beating too fast. I turned to head back to the cabin, but then I saw something that stopped me cold. At the edge of the path, just barely visible in the growing darkness, was a figure. A man, standing still among the trees, facing directly at me. I couldn't make out his features, but I knew he was watching me. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. Who was he? What was he doing out there? The man didn't move, didn't even blink. He just stood there, watching me. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. Then another. Slowly, I turned and began to walk away, but the figure didn't move. Not yet. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze pressing on the back of my neck. I forced myself to keep walking, my footsteps quickening as I tried to get back to the safety of the cabin. By the time I reached the cabin, I was nearly running. My mind was racing, every muscle in my body screaming at me to get inside, lock the door, and never look back. I did just that, bolting the door and pressing my back against it as if that would somehow protect me from whatever or whoever was out there. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, and the fire burning in the stove. I tried to calm my nerves, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the windows, convinced I would see him standing out there again. The thought of him watching, waiting, sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I debated leaving, but the thought of driving back home alone through the dark forest made me hesitate. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the unease gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I stayed inside again, staring at the shadows that moved on the walls as the fire flickered. I barely slept, every noise in the house making my heart race. In the morning, I packed up my things and decided it was time to go. I didn't care if I had to leave early. I just needed to get out of there. I had never felt more relieved than when I drove down the long dirt road, the cabin growing smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the mirror one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me drive away. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that cabin. Couldn't. Every time I think about it, I feel the same sense of dread, that lingering feeling of being watched. And even now, sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting, watching. I woke up to the quiet sounds of nature, the kind you only get when you're in a cabin deep in the woods. It was the perfect weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a small, isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere for a few days to unwind and enjoy the outdoors. It was supposed to be relaxing, just the way we all needed it. The cabin was small but cozy, tucked in between thick woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. The first day had been full of hiking, laughter, and cooking dinner by the fire. We stayed up late, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The atmosphere was so peaceful, so calm, that it made you forget there was anything beyond the trees. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin felt oddly quiet, almost too quiet. There wasn't even the usual sound of wind rustling through the trees. I tried to ignore the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen. The cabin was still, and the air felt crisp. I stretched and walked over to the window. The woods outside looked like they always did, dense and dark, but something caught my attention. There was a movement near the tree line, something low to the ground. It didn't look like an animal I recognized, but I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a deer or something. Still, something about the shape didn't sit right with me. I shrugged it off and went to make coffee. The others were still asleep, so I had the place to myself for a bit. I sat by the window, sipping my coffee, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Then I heard it, a low growl, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the woods, near the same spot where I had seen the movement earlier. I froze, my hand gripping the mug tightly. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a deer, more like something in between. The growl was deep, almost raspy, and it sent a chill down my spine. I waited for a moment, listening. The woods were still, too still. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. Everything was quiet again. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just overtired. But the sense of unease lingered, a feeling like I wasn't alone. The rest of the day passed without incident. We went for a hike in the afternoon, and I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But the closer we got to the cabin in the evening, the more I felt it, the sensation that something was watching us. It was as if the woods had grown darker, the shadows stretching longer than usual. When we made it back to the cabin, I noticed the same low growl again, but this time it was closer. And this time I was sure it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. There was something out there. That night, we all gathered around the fire. The atmosphere was different now, charged with an unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the light of the fire. It was like the woods had a life of their own, and we were intruders in their domain. I didn't want to alarm the others, but I kept my eye on the tree-line, waiting for movement. Every now and then, I thought I saw something watching us, something low to the ground, its eyes reflecting the firelight. But each time I looked, there was nothing there. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We decided to call it a night early, but I had trouble falling asleep. Every little noise outside seemed amplified, and I kept hearing that growl. It was always just out of reach, never loud enough for me to pinpoint its source. But it was there, always there, just waiting in the darkness. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but sleep didn't last long. I was woken by the sound of scratching at the door. It was slow at first, deliberate, almost like someone or something was testing the door, trying to get in. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, listening intently. The scratching stopped, but I could still hear something outside, something moving around. I lay back down, trying to calm myself, but the tension in my chest wouldn't let up. I don't know how much time passed before I heard the sound again, this time louder, scratching followed by a low growl. It was closer now, much closer. I sat up, heart racing, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A heavy thud, like something was moving through the underbrush outside the cabin. It was slow, methodical, as if whatever it was circling the cabin, trying to find a way inside. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A wolf? No, it didn't sound like either of those. The growl was too deep, too raspy, like it came from something larger, something darker. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed to the door, peering out the small crack in the curtains. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it. It was low to the ground, its back hunched, like some twisted version of a dog. Its fur was patchy and matted, its eyes glowing an eerie yellow. It didn't move like a normal animal. It was almost too intelligent. It watched the cabin with an unnerving stillness, its gaze locked on the door like it knew I was watching. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The thing outside hadn't noticed me yet, but I couldn't help but feel that it was waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't normal. No wild animal acted like that. It was something else, something wrong. I ran to wake the others, but by the time I got back, the cabin felt empty. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the sense of something watching us. I told them what I'd seen, but they all just looked at me like I was losing my mind. Still, they agreed to move the furniture and block the windows just in case. We stayed up, listening to the sounds outside. The growl came and went, but there was always that scratching, always that sense of being hunted. I don't know how long we stayed up, but at some point, the growling faded into the distance, and the scratching stopped. The cabin was silent once more. We didn't get much sleep that night. By morning, the air had changed. The thing that had been outside the cabin was gone. The woods were quiet again, but the feeling of unease lingered. We packed up quickly, not wanting to stay a second longer than we had to. As we left the cabin and headed back to the car, I took one last look at the woods. The thing I had seen was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. We didn't speak much on the drive back, but we all knew that something had happened that we couldn't explain. None of us were ever going back to that cabin. The woods had their own secrets, and they weren't meant to be disturbed. I still think about that thing sometimes, wondering what it was and why it watched us that night. But I'm never going to find out. Some things are better left unknown. I was about 16 when it happened. I remember it like it was yesterday, but when I try to explain it to someone, the words just don't seem enough. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, the kind where you get away from everything, the noise, the people, the constant buzz of life, and just sit by a fire, breathe the fresh air, and forget about the world for a while. A couple of friends and I decided to rent a cabin for a weekend out in the woods, a place so remote you could only really reach it by an old, narrow dirt road. That was part of the appeal, honestly. I wanted something quiet, something real. We got there late in the afternoon, the sun still lingering in the sky, casting a warm orange glow across the landscape. The cabin was one of those old log structures, creaky floors and a wooden porch that groaned when you stepped on it. There was a small creek nearby, the kind that gurgled and trickled quietly through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but I figured that was just the feeling of being in nature. We unloaded our stuff, got settled in, and then just relaxed for a bit. The plan was to have a fire later, make some food, and enjoy the night. Everything was fine at first. I can't remember exactly when it started to feel off, but I could tell something wasn't right by the time we had the fire going. I was standing by the cabin, looking out into the woods, when I first noticed it. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but then it stood up on two legs. The thing was huge. I could see it clearly because the fire was casting a light that reached into the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, something that didn't quite make sense. But then I saw its face. It had this twisted, strange face. It looked kind of like a dog, but the eyes were too wide, and it had a snout that was too long. The fur around its shoulders was darker than the rest of its body, and it seemed to shimmer in the firelight. The way it stood, leaning slightly forward, almost as if it was stalking something, made my stomach twist. My first instinct was to look away, but something kept me staring. It didn't move at first, just stood there in the trees, watching. And then, without any warning, it bolted off into the forest. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to notice. They were too busy talking, laughing around the fire. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a bear or some other animal, and my brain was just tricking me into seeing something worse than it was. I wasn't exactly feeling at ease anymore, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the night. As the night went on, the tension in the air seemed to grow. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, little sounds, but they didn't feel right. The woods were too quiet, except for those sounds, which made it worse. I kept my eyes on the dark line of trees beyond the firelight, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching us. Something big. It wasn't long before I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I turned around, expecting to see some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but I couldn't see anything, just darkness beyond the fire. I looked over at my friends, but they were oblivious, still joking and roasting marshmallows. They had no idea, and that was when it happened. The smell. It hit me like a punch in the gut. This awful, putrid smell. It was a mix of wet dog and something rotten. I could feel it creeping into my nose, making my stomach churn. I tried to ignore it, but it was overpowering. I got up from the fire, trying to walk away from it, but the smell just seemed to follow me. Then I heard a growl, low, deep, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't a sound I was familiar with, but it was a sound I would never forget. It wasn't the growl of a bear, or any animal I had ever heard. This one was wrong. It was deep, almost guttural, and it sent a cold wave through me. I froze, standing in place, trying to figure out where it came from. I took a step back towards the cabin, my heart racing. That's when I saw it again. Just beyond the firelight, In the shadows, something was standing there. It was hunched over, its head lowered. I couldn't make out all the details, but I could see enough. It was tall, way taller than a person should be. It looked like it was part man, part dog. The way its limbs were bent, the way it moved, wasn't anything human. My blood turned to ice. I ran back to the fire, shouting to my friends to get inside the cabin. They looked at me like I was crazy. "What are you talking about?" one of them asked, laughing. But I wasn't laughing. I was panicking. There was something out there, something big, and it wasn't human. We locked the doors to the cabin. All of us huddled inside, the only light coming from the fire outside. I could hear the creature moving around, back and forth, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Its growls were getting louder, closer. It was circling the cabin, and I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel it waiting. We didn't have any weapons, no way to defend ourselves. We were just kids in a cabin in the woods, and whatever this thing was, it was out there, and it wasn't going to leave us alone. The growling stopped for a moment, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Scratching. It was coming from the door. The thing was trying to get in. The sound of claws scraping against the wood echoed through the cabin, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to steady my breath, but my hands were shaking. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. It was too real, too terrifying. I glanced out the small window by the door, but I couldn't see anything, just the darkness. The scratching continued, then it stopped. Silence. And then, as if to prove it wasn't gone, I heard a heavy thud, like something slamming into the side of the cabin. I jumped back, my heart racing again. I don't know how long it went on, maybe minutes, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. We didn't dare open the door. We didn't speak. All we could do was listen to the creature outside, its low growls echoing in the night. I thought about all the things I'd heard in stories, how animals could sense fear, how they could smell it. What if it could smell me? What if it could hear my heartbeat? Feel the panic rising inside me. I don't know when the creature left, but when it did, it didn't make any noise. It just vanished. The next morning, we cautiously stepped outside. The sun was up, the birds were chirping like nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt too quiet, the air too still. There were no signs of the creature, no tracks, no fur, but I knew what I saw, what we all saw. We left the cabin early, packed up in a hurry, and got out of there. We didn't speak much on the drive back, but I think we all felt it, that unease, that deep fear, like something was still watching us, waiting for the next time. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was some kind of strange animal or something that had been hiding in those woods for years. I'll never know, but I'll never forget what I saw that night, and I'll never go back to those woods again. It had been a quiet weekend, too quiet for my liking, but I was excited for the solitude of the cabin. I'd rented it for a few days to escape the noise of city life. A small, one-room cabin tucked away in the mountains, far enough that cell service barely existed, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The place was a little run down, the wood siding weathered by time and the elements, but it had character. It smelled of old pine and damp earth, the scent of a place that had been untouched for years. The view out the back was pure wilderness, a forest so thick with trees it felt like something out of a dream. I didn't come out here expecting anything unusual, just a quiet retreat to get some space from everything. But by the end of the first day, I was already regretting it. It started small, the way these things often do. I was making dinner inside the cabin when I first heard the sound. It wasn't much, just a rustling outside, like something moving through the underbrush. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a fox. There were plenty of animals around, after all. Still, there was something unsettling about the sound. It didn't have the usual rhythm of a typical animal. No rustling leaves followed by a familiar scamper or hop. It was slow, deliberate, almost like it was pacing. I shrugged it off, focusing on my cooking, but it didn't stop. I tried to ignore it, continuing to chop vegetables for a stew, but the rustling seemed to grow louder. It was like something was circling the cabin, but I couldn't make out what it was. I finally stepped outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever animal it was. The evening was cold, the kind of crisp chill that makes the air feel sharper in your lungs. The sky had turned dark, and the forest around the cabin looked even more vast and mysterious under the dim light of the lantern I had hanging by the door. I listened carefully, but the only sounds were the distant calls of birds settling for the night and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Nothing seemed out of place. That night, the cabin was quieter than usual. The wind picked up, rattling the walls and the windows. I tried to sleep, but the wind kept me awake, howling like it wanted to get inside. Around midnight, the strange rustling sound returned. Only this time it was louder, and it wasn't just one spot. It moved, like something circling the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, but the pace of the movement was off. It sounded heavier. I stayed in bed, my heart beating a little faster now, trying to ignore it. After what felt like an hour, the noise stopped. For a while, everything was still. The wind had died down. The trees no longer creaked in the breeze. But then, something else happened. I heard a low growl. It wasn't the kind of growl you hear from a dog. Not a playful, friendly kind, but something deep, guttural. The kind of sound that rattles your bones, that makes you freeze. Came from just outside the door, right near the porch. I couldn't tell what it was, but it wasn't any animal I had ever heard before. I sat up, wide-eyed, my senses heightened. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, or even a coyote, but the growl had been too menacing, too unnatural. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, clicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness like a blade, but all I could see were shadows, the tall trees swaying in the night air, their limbs like twisted arms reaching toward the sky. I didn't see anything at first, no sign of movement, no glint of eyes, but that feeling, the feeling that something was there watching me, wouldn't go away. The growl came again. This time it was closer. I jumped out of bed and went to the window, pulling back the thin curtains. My heart pounded in my chest. The beam of light from my flashlight bounced off the window as I tried to scan the area. The forest was black, nothing but shapes in the shadows. I could feel the growl vibrating in my chest, a sound that didn't seem to fit with the peaceful night. Then I saw it, a figure low to the ground, moving just inside the tree line on all fours. It was big, too big to be a normal animal. I squinted, trying to focus. The shape was dark, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was stalking, hunting. My first thought was that it was a wolf, but there was something off about it. The way it moved was strange, unnatural even. The limbs were too long, too gangly. The head was large, with a snout that didn't look quite right. It was too elongated, its eyes glinting a strange amber in the flashlight's beam. I felt a wave of panic hit me like a ton of bricks. My body froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a creature, but not one I recognized. It didn't belong in the woods. It didn't belong anywhere. The creature stopped moving when it realized the light was on it. It didn't turn, didn't retreat. Instead, it stood there, staring straight at me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in some kind of strange standoff. My hands shook so much I could barely hold the flashlight steady, the beam trembling. But it didn't move. It just watched me, its mouth slightly open, a low, raspy breath coming from its throat. I was terrified. I should have locked the door and barricaded myself inside. But all I could do was stare, paralyzed with fear. The creature let out another growl, louder this time, as if warning me. Then, with a sudden lurch, it turned and vanished into the darkness of the trees, its long legs disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe it was a dream, or that I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. Whatever that thing was, it was real. The rest of the night was restless. I didn't sleep a wink, and I kept the light on, my mind constantly drifting back to the image of those glowing eyes in the darkness. In the morning, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, too shaken to stay any longer. The sun had risen, and the world outside seemed peaceful again. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, waiting for me to slip up. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The forest behind me looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. I had seen something out there, something I couldn't explain, and it wasn't the last time I'd feel its eyes on me. The cabin I built was something I always dreamed about having. A quiet place tucked away from the world, where I could get away from everything. I had it all planned out. The rustic wood, the stone fireplace, and enough space to keep me comfortable without feeling too isolated. It sat just outside the forest, surrounded by tall trees that gave the place a sense of seclusion. The kind of seclusion I wanted. I spent months designing the place, and even though it wasn't a mansion, it felt like home the moment I stepped inside. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the smell of fresh pine filled the air. It was perfect. I had a small kitchen area, a living room with a few chairs and a table, and a cozy bedroom in the back. A big porch wrapped around the front, with a few rocking chairs and a hammock. I set it up to feel like a retreat, something simple and calming. But the first time I spent the night in the cabin, things didn't feel as calm as I expected. The first night alone in the cabin was unsettling. I had driven out there that afternoon, unpacked my things, and made a small fire to sit by. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and everything turned dark pretty quickly. The air was still, so quiet that I could hear the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind rustling through the branches. It felt peaceful, but there was something about the silence that made me uneasy. The kind of silence that makes you think you're being watched. I tried to shake it off. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and sat by the fireplace. The crackling of the logs was the only sound, and it was calming, at least for a while. The warmth from the fire made the cabin feel cozy, and I started to relax. After some time, I headed to bed, pulling the thick blanket up to my chin and closing my eyes. I had every intention of sleeping well, but I couldn't. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, but eventually, I heard it. A noise. It was faint at first, just a rustle, almost like an animal outside the window. But then it came again, closer. It wasn't like the usual sounds you hear in the woods, like the wind or the trees creaking. This was deliberate, like something moving, something big. My heart started to beat faster. I convinced myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, something harmless, but the noise didn't stop. It came in slow, deliberate steps, each one louder than the last. I sat up, listening harder. The floorboards creaked under the weight of whatever it was outside, and I could hear the faint scratching of claws against the wood. I was terrified. It felt like the air had thickened, like I couldn't breathe properly. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get up, check the door, make sure everything was locked, but I stayed frozen in bed. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the door to the cabin rattled. Not in a way that made it seem like the wind was blowing it. It was like someone or something was tugging at the handle, trying to get inside. I was paralyzed, my mind racing. Couldn't be someone trying to break in. Could it? No one knew I was here, and the cabin was miles away from the nearest neighbor. Still, I grabbed the flashlight I had left by the side of the bed, and slowly, carefully, I crept to the window. The night outside was pitch black, the trees towering like dark sentinels around the cabin. I could see nothing, but that feeling, that cold, uneasy feeling, hadn't gone away. I stayed by the window, straining my eyes to see anything, but there was nothing moving out there. No sounds. I waited for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, carefully, I stepped back from the window, trying not to make any noise. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I sat up in the dark, listening. Every little noise seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind against the walls, the occasional snap of a twig in the forest. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept checking the locks on the doors, making sure every window was sealed. But still, I couldn't relax. The next day, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The sun was up, and everything seemed normal. The forest was peaceful, the kind of quiet that usually comforted me. I walked through the trees, trying to distract myself from the unease that still lingered from the night before. The further I went into the woods, the more I started to feel at ease again. The rustling of the leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the smell of pine needles. It all made me feel grounded. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Couldn't help it. It wasn't a fear of anything I could see, but rather the feeling of being watched. I walked deeper into the woods, eventually coming to a small clearing. It was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the canopy, illuminating patches of soft grass. I decided to take a break and sit down for a moment, just to enjoy the stillness. That's when I saw it. There, near the edge of the clearing, was a footprint. It was large, much too large for any animal I knew to live around here. At first, I thought maybe it was just some kind of weird mark left by the wind or the rain. But as I crouched down to inspect it, I realized it wasn't just a random shape. It was a deep, well-defined footprint, almost like it had been made recently. The shape was human-like, but the size of it was off. It wasn't a person's footprint. It was something else, something bigger. I stood up slowly, my heart racing. This wasn't just any animal. Something had been out here, something that left that mark. And I wasn't the only one in the woods. I turned around quickly, retracing my steps, eager to get back to the cabin. But the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I felt the same cold, prickling sensation that I had felt the night before. I was being watched again. This time, though, I couldn't ignore it. I knew something was out there. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as I could, trying to stay calm. But when I reached the door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The handle was moving again, not rattling this time, but turning slowly, like someone was trying to get in. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My mind was racing. The door was locked. I was sure of it. But the handle kept turning, the slow, deliberate movement sending a shiver down my spine. I ran inside, locked the door behind me, and grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table. It was the only thing I had that might help if I needed to defend myself. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I paced the cabin, checking every window, making sure everything was secure. Nightfall came again, but this time I didn't feel as safe. I locked all the doors and windows, then turned off the lights. I sat in the dark, my back against the wall, the flashlight in my hands, just waiting for something to happen. And it did. The noise started again, but this time it wasn't just at the door. It was all around the cabin. The same slow, deliberate movements, circling the cabin, coming from every direction. I could hear it, footsteps. I couldn't tell if it was one person or several, but it was too close, too real. I moved to the window, peeking out into the darkness. For a second, I thought I saw a figure just barely visible against the trees. It was tall, thin, and it didn't move like an animal. It moved like a person, but there was something off about it. It didn't seem natural. The figure was standing still, watching the cabin, waiting. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here anymore. I grabbed my bag, packed whatever I could carry, and bolted out the back door. The forest around me was dark, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping to look behind me. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the trees, but there was something else, something that made the hair on my neck stand up, the sound of something following me. I ran for what felt like hours, not stopping once. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I couldn't slow down. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. By the time I finally made it to the main road, the cabin was a distant memory. I sat on the side of the road, gasping for breath, trying to calm down. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever again. It's been weeks since I left. I still don't know what was out there, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching. It was late September when I decided to spend a week alone at my cabin. The cabin is out in the woods, far from any town or other houses. tucked between tall pines and thick brush. It's the kind of place where you feel like the world has stopped, where the noise of everyday life falls away and all that's left is the wind through the trees and the quiet crackle of a fire. I had been there many times before, mostly on weekends, but this was the first time I planned to stay a full week by myself. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and maybe get some writing done. The drive-in was long, about an hour down winding dirt roads that cut through the forest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I parked near the porch. The cabin looked just like I remembered. Weathered with siding darkened by years of rain, a rusty tin roof, and a small stone chimney that puffed out thin curls of smoke from the wood stove inside. I grabbed my bags and locked the truck, my boots making soft thuds on the wooden steps as I climbed onto the porch. The door creaked a little when I opened it. Inside, the cabin was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and old blankets. I had left some firewood stacked near the stove, so I set to work building a fire. The dry wood snapped and popped, the flames casting a warm orange glow that pushed back the growing dark outside. For the first night, I kept busy unpacking, setting up the small propane lanterns, and pulling out books I had brought along. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the occasional call of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The sky was clear, filled with stars so bright and close it almost hurt to look at them. I felt peaceful, maybe a little lonely, but that was the point. The next day, I woke early to the sound of birdsong and the soft light filtering through the window. I dressed in warm clothes and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the ground was still damp with dew. I walked down a narrow path behind the cabin, where the forest opened up to a small clearing. A shallow creek ran through it, water trickling over smooth stones. I sat on a fallen log for a while, watching the sun rise higher and the mist burn off the trees. I spent the day chopping more firewood, fixing a loose board on the porch, and cleaning up around the cabin. In the late afternoon, I cooked a simple dinner on the stove: a tin of beans, some bread, and a cup of strong coffee. As the sun set, the woods grew dark again, and I settled in for the night with a book and the fire crackling beside me. On the third day, something felt off. I can't really say what exactly. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted suddenly, or how the usual sounds of the forest seemed quieter than before. When I stepped outside to get some more firewood, the air was colder, sharper. I thought I heard a snap somewhere in the brush, like a branch breaking, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon moving through the undergrowth. But that evening, while I was sitting by the fire, I noticed the silence again. Normally, there would be frogs croaking near the creek, birds calling for each other, maybe an insect buzzing near the lantern. Instead, it was dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The stillness felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling and went to bed early. The cabin was dark except for the small glow of the fire dying in the stove. As I lay there, I heard it. A faint noise, barely more than a whisper. First, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound right. It was soft and wet, like something moving slowly through dry leaves. I sat up and listened, heart beating a little faster. The noise came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness outside the window, but there was nothing there. I stayed awake for a while, watching the woods, waiting for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The next day, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin more carefully. I walked around, looking for anything unusual. Near the back, where the brush grew thick, I spotted something I hadn't noticed before: tracks. Big ones. They were pressed deep into the soft dirt, large and round with visible claw marks. I knelt down and examined them. They looked like bear tracks. My heart sank a little. I knew bears lived in the area, but I'd never had one come this close before. The tracks were fresh, maybe made that morning or late last night. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared into the thicker trees. I went back inside and locked the doors and windows. I wasn't scared yet, just cautious. I spent the rest of the day indoors, reading and keeping the fire going. But the track stayed on my mind. That night, the noises came again. Louder this time. Branches snapping, leaves rustling just beyond the edge of the porch. I kept the flashlight ready, shining it into the dark every few minutes. Once, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the beam, low to the ground, watching me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After a long moment, the eyes vanished into the black. I barely slept. When morning came, I felt drained, like I hadn't rested at all. Over the next 2 days, the visits became more frequent. Every night, the sounds crept closer. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line, dark shapes slipping between the trunks. I found more tracks, even some torn apart bird nests on the ground nearby. The sense of being watched was constant, and my nerves frayed. I started taking extra precautions. I set up some makeshift barriers around the cabin with sticks and rocks, hoping to deter anything from getting too close. I kept the fire burning bright all night, since the light seemed to keep the creatures at bay. I made sure to never go outside alone after dark. On the 6th day, I noticed something else. My food supplies were disturbed. The bags of dried fruit and nuts I had hung on hooks near the kitchen doorway were torn open. Some spilled onto the floor. Whatever was coming close was bold, more than just a curious animal. I was running out of options. I called the ranger station on my satellite phone, explaining my situation without sounding panicked. They told me to stay inside, keep the fire going, and that a ranger would come by the next day for a check. That night, I barely dared to move. Every sound was sharp and loud in the silence. At one point, I thought I heard something clawing at the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door and waited, muscles tense. The sounds stopped after a while, fading into the distance. I finally drifted into a restless sleep, waking just as dawn began to lighten the sky. The ranger arrived in the afternoon, a tall man with a calm voice. We walked around the cabin together, him pointing out bear tracks, broken branches, and claw marks on the wood near the back door. He said the bear was probably a big male looking for food before winter. He advised me to keep everything sealed, avoid leaving scraps outside, and to keep a noisemaker handy in case the bear came close again. I felt a little relieved, but also tired in a way I hadn't expected. The peaceful solitude I came for had been replaced by a constant tension. The cabin, my safe place, had turned into a trap where I felt exposed and vulnerable. That night was the last one I stayed. I kept the fire roaring and the doors locked tight. The woods seemed quieter after the ranger left, but I knew the bear was still out there, somewhere in the shadows. In the morning, I packed up quickly and left, the gravel crunching under my tires as I drove away. The trees disappeared behind me, the cabin shrinking into the distance. I wasn't sure if I'd come back anytime soon. The cabin was beautiful and peaceful when the forest was calm. But that week taught me how quickly nature could turn unpredictable, how close danger could get when you least expect it. The woods don't care about you. They go on wild and free whether you're there or not. And sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. I remember the first time I saw it. It was a late October weekend, and I had rented a small, remote cabin in the woods for a few days of quiet alone time. I needed a break from everything: work, people, the city noise. The cabin was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road or neighbor, surrounded by towering pine and oak trees that were already losing their leaves to the chill of fall. It felt perfect at the time, a chance to be alone with nature. The first day was peaceful. I arrived in the afternoon, lugging my bags along a narrow dirt trail until I reached the cabin. It looked like something out of a postcard. Rough wooden logs stacked tight, a stone chimney, and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. Inside was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, and a bed in the corner. I stacked some firewood by the door and started a fire to take the edge off the cold. As the sun went down, the forest turned dark and quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. I settled in with a book, the fire crackling softly beside me. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound, even the ones you don't want to. Later that night, just before I was about to turn off the lights, I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, like footsteps on dry leaves. I thought maybe it was a deer or some other animal, but then it stopped and was replaced by a low, guttural growl. It was deep and rough, not like any dog or coyote I'd ever heard. My skin prickled. I stayed quiet and listened. The growl faded away slowly, but the feeling it left didn't. The next morning, I found strange footprints outside near the porch. They were unlike any I'd seen before. Too big and elongated, with a shape that looked like a mix between a dog's paw and a human foot. The prints led into the woods, disappearing among the fallen leaves. I felt uneasy but told myself it was probably some weird animal or a hunter's prank. During the day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was thick and tangled with underbrush, fallen branches, and moss-covered rocks. I noticed broken tree limbs hanging low, as if something large had pushed through. There were scratch marks on several trees, deep gouges in the bark that looked like claws had raked across them. The marks were fresh. As evening approached again, the air grew colder and heavier. I decided to stay inside and build a strong fire. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and the cabin's wooden walls moan. Then I heard it again, the growl closer this time. It was mixed with a low, guttural panting and heavy breathing. I stood up, heart pounding, and peered out the window, trying to see through the thick shadows. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of something moving, tall and lean but hunched over, covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight's reflection, yellow and unblinking. It didn't move like any animal I'd seen. It was too fast, too quiet for something that size. It was almost like a man, but not quite. I backed away from the window, trying to calm my shaking hands. I didn't want to believe what I'd seen. It must have been a trick of the light, or maybe an animal I didn't recognize. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night was restless. Every crack of wood, every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I kept the fire burning bright and stayed near it. Hours passed, and I heard those strange sounds off and on. The growling, the panting, the occasional scrape of claws against bark. Once, something moved right outside the cabin door, just out of sight. I didn't sleep much. At one point, I heard heavy footsteps pacing around the cabin, slow and deliberate, almost like it was waiting or trying to decide something. I stayed quiet and didn't move, hoping it would go away. By morning, the fire had burned low, and the cabin was cold again. Outside, the footprints were clearer now, larger and deeper, as if whatever it was had pressed hard into the earth. They circled the cabin, never moving far, always staying close. That day, I spent hours checking my phone for signal. Nothing. No calls, no messages, no internet. I was completely cut off. The nearest road was miles away, and the weather was getting colder, threatening rain. In the late afternoon, I went for a walk deeper into the woods, hoping to distract myself. I followed a small creek lined with rocks slick from the fall rain. The forest was eerily silent, except for the steady rush of water. Suddenly, I saw fresh broken branches ahead, snapped about waist high. It looked like something large had pushed through, moving fast. Then I heard it again. A breath, heavy and uneven, coming from behind a thick clump of trees. I stopped, holding my breath, heart hammering. I could see nothing but shadows. Then a low growl rumbled out. It wasn't far. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, adrenaline pushing my legs faster. Behind me, the growling followed, mixing with the crunch of leaves under heavy feet. I didn't look back until I was inside, locking the door behind me and bolting every latch. The rest of the evening was tense. I kept all the lights on and sat close to the fire. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses through the windows of movement in the trees. The creature was still there, stalking the edge of the clearing. Late at night, the creature came closer. I could hear it breathing hard, scratching at the cabin's wooden walls with long claws. The sounds echoed through the quiet forest, sharp and threatening. It was testing the structure, trying to find a way in. I grabbed a heavy metal rod from the kitchen and stayed near the door, ready to defend myself. My mind raced, trying to think how to survive until morning. I remembered the hunting stories I'd heard as a kid. Fire was supposed to keep wild animals away, but this thing seemed almost fearless. Hours passed like that. The creature paced outside, growling, panting, and scraping. Occasionally, it would stop and press its head or long snout against the cabin walls. Its breath steamed in the cold air. At one point, I saw it shift to stand fully upright, over 6 feet tall, with arms longer than any man's, ending in claws that could shred wood. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, but leaving meant stepping into the dark woods with something hunting me. When dawn finally came, the creature was gone. The forest was still and quiet again, but the evidence of its visit was everywhere. The deep scratches on the walls, broken branches near the windows, and those enormous footprints circling the cabin like a warning. I packed up quickly, never taking my eyes off the forest. As I walked the trail back to my car, I kept hearing distant growls fading into the morning mist. I didn't stop until I was back on the paved road. I haven't returned to that cabin since, but I still wonder what that thing was. Some kind of dogman, half beast, half man, something wild and dangerous that lives where the forest is deepest and darkest. I learned that some parts of nature are better left alone. There are things out there that don't belong to any stories or legends. They are real, and they watch quietly, waiting for you to make a mistake. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees on a cold fall night, I swear I can still hear that low growl in the distance, reminding me to never go back. It was early October when I arrived at the cabin, a small, weathered place tucked deep into the thick forest of the northern Rockies. I'd been planning this trip for months. A solo getaway to get away from the noise of the city, to breathe clean air, and to just be alone with the trees, the quiet, and myself. The forest was already dressed in fall colors, with yellows and reds and browns painting the leaves. The air had that crisp edge, the kind that promises the coming cold but still lets the warmth of the sun sink in during the day. The cabin itself sat on the edge of a small clearing. It was old but sturdy, built from logs that looked like they'd weathered 100 winters. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. The windows were dusty and fogged over, but the inside was surprisingly clean. A wood stove stood in the corner, and there was a stack of firewood piled against the wall outside. I'd brought food, water, a flashlight, and the essentials. No internet, no phone signal, just the wilderness. After unpacking, I took a long walk to explore the nearby woods. The trees were tall and dense, mostly pine and fir, with a thick layer of needles covering the ground. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine was strong. Every now and then, I heard the snap of a twig or the rustle of a small animal darting through the underbrush. The forest was alive but quiet, like it was holding its breath. Back at the cabin, I started a fire in the stove. The flames flickered and cast warm shadows on the wooden walls. Outside, the sky darkened quickly. The forest swallowed the light faster than the city did. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the soft rustling of leaves. I ate a simple meal and settled in with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Around 9 p.m., just as I was about to head to bed, I noticed something moving in the shadows beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a large dog, but the shape was bulky and slow, almost deliberate. It disappeared behind the trees before I could get a clear look. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of smoke and wood burning. The fire in the stove had mostly died down overnight. I stepped outside and found fresh tracks in the soft earth near the porch. The prints were huge, round, and had claws, bear tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I'd heard about bears in these woods, but being this close was a different thing entirely. The tracks led from the forest edge, past the cabin, and back again, as if the bear had been pacing. I didn't panic. Come prepared. I made sure to store all my food securely in the cabin and outside, hung a few bags high up from a tree with rope. I knew better than to leave anything out that might attract a bear. The days passed quietly, with only the occasional rustle or distant call of wildlife. I spent my time reading, hiking a little, and just watching the trees change with the light. But as the sun set on the third day, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a shadow that didn't belong, the sound of heavy footsteps breaking twigs just beyond sight. That night, I slept with the cabin door locked, the windows closed tight. Still, around midnight, I woke to a heavy thud outside. My heart pounded. I got up and crept to the window. Outside, in the pale moonlight, I saw it. A massive bear, black and muscular, standing on its hind legs near the firewood pile. It was sniffing the air, looking for something. I froze, watching as it pawed at the wood stack, scattering logs. My flashlight was on the table by the door, but I dared not move. The bear grunted softly, then moved toward the porch. I held my breath as it climbed the steps, the wood creaking under its weight. The smell of wet fur and musk filled the air. The cabin door was locked tight, but the bear swiped its massive paw at the door frame, leaving deep scratches. The windows rattled from its force. I grabbed my bear spray from under the bed, my hands shaking, but the bear didn't stay long. After a minute or two, it backed down, dropping to all fours, and disappeared into the forest as silently as it had come. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the sounds outside, feeling the cabin shudder with every gust of wind. The next day, I inspected the porch. Deep gouges and scratches marred the wood. Some logs were missing from the firewood pile, crushed or broken. The bear had been searching for food or just curious, but it was clear it had been bold. I realized how close I had come to danger. A bear this large could easily break down the door or climb through a window if it wanted to. I doubled my precautions, cleared away any food scent, sealed all containers, and made sure everything that smelled like food was out of reach. Over the following 2 days, the bear returned several times. Always at night, always near the cabin, but never trying to break in again. It was a constant reminder that I was not alone in the forest. Each time, I could feel the raw power of the animal, the intelligence in its eyes, and the primal strength it held. On the final night before I planned to leave, the bear came closer than ever. It sat on its haunches at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. The moonlight shone on its thick fur, and I could see the scars on its face, marks from past fights or encounters. It looked tired but watchful. I stayed inside, silent and still, not wanting to provoke it. The wind rustled the leaves, and the fire in the stove flickered low. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, the bear rose and turned slowly, disappearing back into the forest. The sense of tension in the air lifted. When morning came, I packed my things quickly but carefully. Before leaving, I stood on the porch and looked out over the clearing. The forest was quiet and still, holding its secrets and its wildness. I understood then that the forest wasn't mine to control. I was just a visitor, passing through a land that belonged to creatures older and stronger than me. The bear's visits were a warning, a reminder of the balance between man and nature. I left the cabin with respect and a deep sense of humility. The experience stayed with me. The sound of heavy paws on the porch, the feeling of being watched, the power of an animal wild and free. Even now, back in the city, I think about that bear and the quiet woods. It wasn't a story of terror or violence, but of survival, respect, and the raw reality of the wilderness. The forest had given me a gift, a glimpse of a world where humans are guests, and the wild always holds the upper hand. The forest around the cabin was quiet. Too quiet, I thought as I stood on the small porch, staring out into the thick trees. The air was cold and damp, the smell of wet earth and pine heavy all around me. I had been coming here for years, this small, rundown cabin that my uncle had left me after he passed. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, with no neighbors for at least a half-hour drive. The kind of place people come to escape the noise of cities and just be alone with nature. I liked the peace it gave me, the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth, the soft rustling of leaves outside. the occasional call of an owl or the far-off howl of a coyote. That was normal. That was comforting. But tonight, something was off. I had spent the day chopping wood, stacking it neatly by the side of the cabin, and fixing a broken window shutter. As the sun dipped low, I built a fire inside, settled into an old armchair with a thick wool blanket, and tried to read. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The forest outside looked darker than usual, shadows lengthening and shifting in ways I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just the way the light was fading, or maybe the wind moving the branches in strange patterns. But still, the feeling stayed, a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I pushed the feeling aside and went outside to get some fresh air, hoping to shake the nervousness. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped down, the cold wood pressing through the thin soles of my boots. The sky was overcast now, thick clouds blotting out the stars. The wind was almost silent, but every so often, I thought I heard a faint, low growl carried through the trees. I stopped and looked around, heart beating a little faster. There was nothing there, just the endless stretch of dark forest. But that growl had been real. It had a rough, guttural sound, like a dog's throat, but deeper and more menacing. I went back inside and locked the door, sliding the bolt home. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in with the silence. I fed the fire with a few more logs, the flames crackling and throwing shadows across the worn wooden floor. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe the sound came from a wild animal, maybe a bear or a big dog wandering through the forest. I had seen signs of coyotes around before, and once or twice a wolf track, but nothing threatening. I'd always felt safe here, or at least I thought I had. But that night, as the hours passed and the fire died down, the feeling grew heavier. Something was out there, moving slowly through the dark. Something watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife from the table, just in case. The cabin's walls were thin, and the wind rattled the windows. I stepped outside again, this time more alert. The forest looked endless in the weak beam of the flashlight, every branch and leaf casting long, eerie shadows. I called out softly, "Hello?" But my voice sounded weak in the night. No answer, just silence. Then I heard it again. That low, terrible growl, much closer this time. It wasn't a normal animal sound. It was too rough, too deep, like something that shouldn't exist. My heart slammed in my chest, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. I aimed the flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees. It wasn't running or walking like an animal I knew. Its movements were jerky but deliberate, like it was stalking me. I squinted through the dark. The shape was hard to make out, but it was tall. Taller than any dog or wolf I had seen. Its limbs were long and thin, but it moved with a strange strength, muscles rippling under dark fur that caught the little light from the flashlight. The face was the worst. I caught a glimpse for a second, and it was like a twisted mix between a dog and a man. The snout was long and sharp, filled with teeth that glinted white in the darkness. Its eyes were yellow and glowing faintly, locked on me with a chilling intelligence. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run back inside, but my legs felt like they were stuck in the mud. The thing let out a low bark, almost a growl, that shook the night air. It was warning me, or maybe it was trying to scare me. I backed up slowly, turning toward the cabin. The creature followed, moving with an unnatural speed. I scrambled to the door, my hands fumbling with the lock, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Finally inside, I slammed the door and locked it tight. I pressed my back against the wood, knife still in hand, and listened. Outside, the creature circled the cabin, its heavy paws thudding softly on the ground. I could hear it sniffing around the windows, the wet sound of its nose pressing against the glass sending chills down my spine. It was patient. It didn't rush. It didn't try to break in, just waited, like it knew I couldn't escape. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. The creature stayed outside, moving slowly but constantly, never leaving. Its growls and barks echoed faintly, mixing with the wind. I thought about calling someone, but there was no cell signal this far out. The old landline phone in the cabin was dead, battery long gone. I was alone. As dawn began to break, the creature finally retreated, melting back into the forest like a shadow. I waited a long time before stepping outside, flashlight ready. The forest looked normal in the gray morning light. No sign of the creature except for deep paw prints around the cabin, larger than any dog or wolf, and strange scratches on the doorframe, like claws trying to get in. I packed my things quickly that day, deciding I wouldn't stay another night. I drove out as fast as I could, glancing nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin again, and I never told anyone what I saw that night. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is quiet, I swear I can still hear that low growl in the distance. It was the kind of late fall that makes the woods smell damp and cold, a smell mixed with rotting leaves and wet earth. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks, the kind of place you'd pick if you wanted to get away from everything. I was alone there for a few days, planning to write and fish in the nearby lake, which was only a 10-minute walk through the thick woods. The cabin was old but sturdy, built of logs weathered gray by many winters. Inside, the floor creaked under every step, and the windows rattled softly when the wind blew through the trees. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked some wood by the fireplace, and walked down to the lake as the sun set. The sky painted pink and purple. The water was still and cold, and I caught a few fish using a simple rod and some worms I brought with me. Back at the cabin, I lit a fire, sat by it with a book, and felt the kind of peace that city life never gives you. The second day was when things started to feel off, but I didn't notice at first. The woods seemed quieter than usual. I didn't hear birds singing or squirrels rustling, just the wind pushing through the branches. I told myself it was normal. Wild animals don't always make noise, but the silence was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. In the late afternoon, I decided to explore a trail I hadn't noticed before, a narrow path running east from the cabin. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push branches aside, stepping over roots slick with moss. The ground was soft from recent rain, leaving deep prints of my boots behind me. After about half an hour, the trail opened into another clearing, smaller than the one with the cabin, filled with fallen logs and old stumps covered in mushrooms and lichen. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. That's when I saw it, a shape moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing, low and fast. At first, I thought it was a dog or some kind of large fox, but the way it moved was strange, too stiff, almost unnatural. Its legs were long and thin but bent oddly, like they weren't built for running smoothly. The fur was patchy, a dull mix of grays and browns, with patches of bare skin that looked raw. Its head was narrow and pointed but flattened on top, with eyes that reflected the fading light, glowing faintly amber. It stopped and stared at me for a moment that felt far too long. I froze, unsure if I should move or stay still. The creature didn't growl or bark. It just watched, tilting its head slightly, as if studying me. Its mouth was slightly open, showing uneven, yellowed teeth that didn't look right for a dog or wolf. The nose twitched as if it caught my scent. Then it disappeared back into the shadows with a quick, jerky movement, vanishing before I could blink. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it must have been some kind of sick wild animal, maybe a stray dog or a coyote with mange. I didn't want to think about it too much, so I headed back to the cabin as fast as I could, trying to calm my nerves. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual and double-checked all the windows and doors. I could hear something moving outside, light footsteps or maybe twigs breaking, but nothing ever came close to the cabin. I tried to sleep but kept waking up every hour, listening to the dark. The third day was worse. When I stepped outside in the morning, I found strange prints in the soft ground around the cabin. They were bigger than a dog's but smaller than a deer's, roughly the size of a large man's hand. The shape was odd, 3 long toes ending in sharp claws, with a thin, pointed pad at the back. The prints didn't match anything I knew from the area. I followed them for a while into the woods, but they stopped suddenly near a fallen tree. Later in the afternoon, while gathering firewood, I heard a rustling behind me. Turning quickly, I caught a glimpse of that same creature, or something like it, slipping between the trees. It moved fast, almost silently, but this time it looked even stranger. Its body seemed thinner, almost emaciated, with ribs showing beneath dirty fur. Its eyes were locked on me, and I swear it made a low, guttural sound, like a mix between a growl and a cough. I dropped the wood and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. For hours, I stayed inside, staring out the window, watching for any sign of it. The woods felt alive in a way that was cold and hungry. When night fell, I heard scratching at the cabin walls and soft howls in the distance. I kept the fire burning all night, sitting close with a heavy stick in my hand. On the fourth day, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, trying not to panic. But before I could get in my car, I saw it again. It stood at the edge of the clearing, fully visible now in the weak morning light. The creature was about the size of a large dog but moved with a strange, awkward gait. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its eyes were sad and wild. I didn't move. It didn't move. After a long moment, it turned away slowly, disappearing into the forest. I got in the car and drove off, not looking back. I never found out what that creature was. I called the local ranger station when I got back to town, but they said there were no known animals like that in the area. Maybe it was a sick or injured coyote, or a wild dog that had wandered far from civilization. Whatever it was real, and it had watched me for days in those woods. Since then, I haven't gone back to that cabin, but I still think about those strange eyes watching me from the shadows, the way that creature moved and breathed in the cold, damp forest. The woods aren't always empty or safe, and some things don't belong to any story or legend. They're just there, quietly waiting in the dark. It was a late September afternoon when I arrived at the cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A quiet week alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the endless distractions of everyday life. The cabin itself sat on the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and a few scattered birch trees. The air smelled fresh, with a faint hint of pine sap and damp earth. It was peaceful, or so I thought. The drive had been long but easy. The road twisted through hills and patches of open farmland before narrowing into a gravel path that led directly to the cabin. I parked my car on a small clearing right in front of the cabin. It was a modest structure, made of weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a front porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. The windows were dirty but still let in a good amount of light. I pulled my bags out of the trunk, setting them down by the door. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had planned to settle in quickly, make a fire, and cook some dinner before the darkness set in. But as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I noticed something strange. There were faint footprints in the dirt right outside the back door, some barely visible on the porch steps. They didn't look fresh, but they definitely weren't from any animal. The pattern was human boots with deep treads. I shook the thought off, telling myself maybe the previous owner or a worker had left them behind. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and faint mildew. Dust covered the corners, and cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The furniture was sparse: a rickety table, 2 chairs, a worn-out sofa, and a small bed in the back room. I flicked on the old electric lantern I'd brought and started unpacking my gear. The light flickered but held steady. After getting the fire going in the fireplace, I settled down with a cup of coffee, listening to the crackle of the flames. Outside, the forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. The peacefulness was exactly what I wanted. Later, as twilight deepened, I stepped outside onto the porch to stretch. The sky was turning a deep blue, and the first stars began to appear. I looked up and down the gravel path leading away from the cabin. Nothing moved. No cars. No people. No animals except a distant owl hooting somewhere deep in the woods. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a shadow, a figure standing near the edge of the tree line about 200 yards from the cabin. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the twilight. His posture was rigid, almost unnatural, and he stood completely still, watching the cabin. The way he didn't move made my skin crawl. I blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again a few seconds later, he was still there, exactly in the same spot, staring. I felt a chill even though the night was still warm. Without making a sound, I went back inside and locked every door and window. My heart was pounding, but I tried to calm myself down, thinking maybe he was just a hunter or a hiker passing through. Maybe he had seen the cabin and was just curious. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, listening. The house felt small and vulnerable, like it was shrinking around me. I could hear the wind through the cracks in the window frames, the occasional creak of the old wood settling, but no footsteps outside, no movement at all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching. The next morning, I woke early, feeling restless. The sun shone weakly through the thin clouds, making the forest look damp and gray. I decided to take a walk along one of the dirt trails that wound through the woods behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. The trail was narrow and lined with thick undergrowth. The trees were tall and close together, their branches forming a loose canopy overhead. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled faintly of wet moss and pine needles. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the night before lurking in the shadows. But the woods were empty, save for birds flitting between branches and the occasional chipmunk scurrying across the path. After about an hour, I turned back toward the cabin, feeling a little more at ease. The sun had burned off the morning fog, and the woods were brighter now. But when I reached the clearing, my heart dropped. The man was there again, this time closer, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, standing just beyond a cluster of birch trees. He hadn't moved. He was watching. I froze, panic rising in my chest. He was too far away to hear me, and I didn't want to make a sound or give away that I knew he was there. I stared back at him, trying to read his face in the dim light. His features were rough and unshaven. His eyes seemed cold, empty. Without thinking, I hurried toward the cabin, my footsteps loud on the gravel. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and locked the door behind me. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside. I avoided the windows and kept the curtains drawn. I didn't even want to look outside. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, the creak of a branch, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept thinking about the man standing outside, waiting. I wondered how long he had been watching me. How long had he been following me? On the third day, I found footprints again. Fresh ones this time. Heavy boot prints around the cabin, pressed deep into the soft dirt. They were circling the cabin, coming close to the windows, then disappearing into the woods. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police because I was too far away, and I wasn't even sure anyone would believe me. The nearest town was more than 20 miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. Instead, I started preparing. I gathered firewood and kept a large knife on me at all times. I cleared the area around the cabin, cutting away low branches and brush so I could see anyone coming. I set small traps, simple things like tripwires made from string tied between trees, hoping to hear or see if someone was sneaking around. Each night, I sat by the fire with the cabin door locked tight, listening to the forest, straining to catch any sound of footsteps or movement. On the fourth day, I heard footsteps outside the door late at night. Slow, heavy steps like someone pacing back and forth. My heart stopped. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife. The footsteps moved away, then circled back. I could hear breathing now, heavy and uneven, just outside the wall. I wanted to scream or run, but I knew that would only make things worse. So I stayed silent, waiting until the footsteps finally faded into the darkness. That morning, I found scratches on the wooden door, long, deep gouges, like claws or a knife. I pressed my hand to the wood, feeling the rough grooves. Someone had tried to break in. From that moment, I knew this was serious. This wasn't some random hiker or hunter. This was someone who had been stalking me for days, maybe even longer. I started keeping a small journal, writing down everything I noticed: the time of the footsteps, the direction of the footprints, the way the man moved through the woods. I studied the area around the cabin, trying to find signs of where he might be hiding during the day. One afternoon, I spotted him again. He was crouched behind a fallen tree about 100 yards away, watching me through the thick brush. His face was expressionless, and when he saw me looking, he vanished into the trees like a ghost. The fear was constant now. I felt like a prisoner in my own refuge. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like him. I barely ate, barely slept. On the 6th day, I realized I had to get out. Staying wasn't safe. I packed everything into my car as quickly as possible, trying to stay calm despite the pounding in my chest. I took one last look at the cabin. The man wasn't there, but I could feel his eyes on me. I started the engine and pulled onto the gravel road, glancing nervously into the rearview mirror. The trees blurred past as I drove away, the sun rising behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally found a phone signal and called the police. They took my report seriously and sent officers to check the cabin. But by then, the man was gone. They found footprints and broken branches, signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby, watching the cabin. The officers told me to never return alone, and I agreed. Looking back, I realized how close I came to something dangerous. Someone who had been tracking me for days without me noticing until it was almost too late. The woods are beautiful, but they can hide things that no one wants to see. I never went back to that cabin again. Instead, I found a small apartment in town, with locked doors and neighbors nearby. The peace I had sought in the woods turned into a lesson. Sometimes, solitude can attract the wrong kind of attention, and safety can only come from awareness and caution. The man was never caught, but I carry that fear with me still. A reminder that even the quietest places can hold the darkest threats, and sometimes, the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster, but a person. I climbed down the narrow path from the ridge to the small clearing where my cabin waited, its wooden walls weathered to a soft gray by years of rain and sun. The air felt heavy, pulsing with the hush that only a dense forest can hold. Each step crackled over dry leaves and snapped twigs, and I felt the weight of silence settling across my shoulders. My boots pressed firm into the soft earth, the smell of moss rising to meet me. I had come to this place seeking solitude, a break from the hum of city life, but as the late afternoon light dipped behind the trees, I felt a tightening in my chest that I could not shake. The cabin door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the dusty lamplight I'd left burning on the table inside. The room smelled faintly of old pine and burned oil. I dropped my pack by the door and ran my palm along the rough plank of the wall. It felt cool, solid. I always liked that, the knowledge that these walls had withstood storms and wind and time. The small fireplace at the far end of the room still held ashes from my last fire. I knelt to stir them, the fine gray powder drifting up in a soft cloud, and then I added a fresh log. The wood snapped and hissed as flames crept along its length, filling the room with warmth and a gentle glow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling branches against each other high above. A low moan came through the walls as the cabin shifted slightly on its foundation. I felt my heartbeat quicken and took a slow breath to steady myself. It was just wind, I told myself. I walked over to the small wooden table where I kept a tin of coffee beans, pretzel crackers, and a narrow skillet. I scooped beans into the grinder, the metal turning under my hand as a sharp aroma began to fill the air. I set the kettle on the wood stove and watched my reflection in the dark glass window. Pale face, dark circles under my eyes, tension around my mouth. This trip was supposed to renew me, to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. Instead, I felt more alert than ever. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the clearing. I paused at the window, staring out into the trees. The forest was full of shapes, branches and trunks weaving together into patterns that shifted with the dying light. I tried to make sense of what I saw, A trunk that looked like a crouching figure, a branch that might be an arm. But each time I blinked, the shapes melted back into wood and leaves. My heart pounded beneath my jacket. Inside, I poured boiling water over the coffee grounds, the sharp hiss turning to a soft hiss as the brew dripped into my mug. I carried it back to the table and wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Steam curled up and blurred my view of the far corner, where a small wood shelf held a few books, a coil of rope, and an old hunting knife with a handle worn smooth by use. I thought about them, stories of survival, the many times people had counted on that rope, that blade. I felt a shiver climb my spine, though the cabin was still warm and cozy. I turned back to the window. Darkness was gathering fast. The last sliver of orange sun slid behind the ridgeline, and the forest was swallowed by blue-gray shadows. A branch scraped against the cabin's side, sharp and sudden, like a fingernail on a chalkboard. My mug rattled on the table. I jerked back, coffee sloshing over the rim. Heart hammering, I dropped the mug. It shattered on the floorboards, porcelain shards skittering under the table. I froze, listening. Silence pressed in again, deeper than before. No wind, no animals, nothing but the steady thrum of my blood in my ears. After a moment, I forced myself to move. I knelt to pick up the larger shards, careful of the sharp edges. My fingers trembled. I wrapped them in a cloth and set the pieces near the sink. My eyes flicked back to the window. Nothing. I stood and crossed to the door. I turned the simple latch and eased it open, stepping onto the narrow porch. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and pine. I scanned the clearing, heart still pounding too hard. Moonlight glinted off wet leaves but offered little comfort. The woods looked like a dark sea, endless and silent. I reached out and touched the railing, feeling the rough grain under my fingertips. I exhaled slowly, telling myself I just dropped the mug. That was all. But then a sound drifted through the trees, soft, deliberate. A footstep on dry leaves, far off but clear. I froze, hand on the railing, every muscle coiled. The footstep came again, then another, closer. I peered into the darkness, trying to pick out movement. A shadow slid between two trunks 20 yards away. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, so still I thought it might be a fallen branch. Then it shifted, leaned forward, and a dark shape moved again. I stumbled back inside, heart rattling my ribs. I slammed the door and bolted the latch, my hands slick with sweat. My breath came in shallow bursts. I turned to the corner where the rifle leaned against the wall, its metal barrel dull in the firelight. I had cleaned it that morning and set it there. My hand closed around the cool wood stock. I eased it free and pulled back the bolt, checking that one round lay in the chamber. The weight in my hands brought a measure of calm. I closed the bolt and pressed the butt into my shoulder, the cold metal against my cheek. I crept to the window, heart thudding in my throat, and set the rifle steady on the windowsill. I opened the latch and cracked the window an inch. Outside, the clearing lay empty. No shape, no movement. Only the wind drifting through the branches, distant and soft. I held my breath and waited. Time stretched and distorted, seconds felt like minutes. Then another sound, a low snap, almost under my feet. I peered down and saw nothing. I leaned forward, rifle ready. The snap came again. My gaze snapped to the floor. Under the edge of the floorboard, I saw a small twig. It must have fallen through a gap and caught on the board. I exhaled in a rush, disbelief and relief flooding me. My heart slowed as I backed away from the window. I dropped the rifle onto the table with a loud thunk that made me wince. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, and hugged my knees. The room spun lightly for a moment. I closed my eyes and took deep, steadying breaths. There had been nothing out there, just wind, just a twig. Yet the feeling in my chest stayed tight, anxious. I lay back on the floor, staring up at the rafters. Through the slats, I could see a patch of moonlight. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I felt raw and exposed, like a traveler in a strange land. I forced myself to rise and walked back to the hearth. I knelt and scooped kindling onto the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The heat felt good, real. I sat on the floor close to the fire, arms wrapped around my legs. The logs crackled, and the light danced across the walls. I stayed there until the fire died back to embers, the cabin growing cold again. I gathered the embers into the center and fed in one last log, settling it so the glow would last through the night. Then I stood and crossed to the bed, a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. I pulled on a thicker sweater and crawled under the blanket. I lay with the rifle across my chest and watched the fire die down to glowing coals. Outside, the wind rose again, and I heard it whisper through the trees, but I did not move. I stared at the coals until my eyes grew heavy. I woke on a gray morning. The sky was pale and dim, clouds low and heavy. Light seeped through the window, painting the room in soft gray. I sat up slowly, each movement deliberate. My body felt stiff. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Silence, steady and calm. I stood and stretched, then went to the hearth. The coals glowed faintly. I added a small stick, coaxing a gentle flame. I set the kettle on the wood stove and filled my mug from the jug of water on the shelf. While the coffee brewed, I opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. The clearing lay washed in mist, the grass damp with dew. The forest beyond stood silent and still. No branches scraped the cabin, no shadows lurked. Only sound was the faint drip of water from leaves. I walked to the edge of the clearing and bent to pick up a stick, testing the ground. All peaceful, yet I felt different. The night before had stretched me thin, shown me my own fear. I felt a new calm in its place, like cold water poured over hot metal. Back inside, I poured my coffee and carried it to the table. I set the rifle by the wall, cleaning flush on the stock. I oiled the metal and laid it on the shelf. I felt no shame in having armed myself. It was a tool, an old friend, something to rely on if the need came. But today there was no need. Today the cabin was just a cabin. I sat by the fire, sipping coffee and breathing in the quiet. I spent the morning gathering wood, stacking logs by the door. I swept up the broken mug pieces and swept the floor clean. I organized my pack, separating items I would need for the hike back down. I checked my map, tracing the trail. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently, We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I didn't want to come up here. I knew it was a bad idea the moment I agreed to spend the weekend in that cabin deep in the woods. But it was supposed to be a break, a way to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the endless demands, and the constant chatter in my head. Just me, the cold, the trees, and some silence. That was the plan anyway. The drive itself was quiet. I left late Friday afternoon, taking the narrow, winding road that cut through miles of forest. The trees were tall and dense, their bare branches scraping the gray sky. It was late fall, almost winter, but the snow hadn't come yet. The ground was soaked from rain earlier in the week, and patches of mud threatened to catch my tires. I had to be careful. The road wasn't exactly well maintained, and there was no cell service for most of the way. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked like something straight out of a postcard. Small, made of rough logs, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and it smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. The place was isolated, sitting alone in a small clearing surrounded by forest. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just trees as far as the eye could see. I didn't know who had stayed here before, but the cabin was simple and old. Inside, it smelled of dust and something woodsy. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I explored. There was a small kitchen with a rusty stove, a table with 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a woodpile stacked against one wall. The windows were small, their glass thick and a little cloudy. Outside, the wind whispered through the branches, making strange sounds. The first night was quiet. I chopped some wood and built a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. I made some coffee on the stove and sat by the fire, listening to the crackling logs. The forest outside was dark and still, only the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of a small animal breaking the silence. I slept poorly. The bed was hard and the cold seeped in through the cracks in the walls. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. The tapping of a branch against the window, the distant howl of a coyote. I woke several times, feeling watched even though I knew it was just my imagination. The next day, I went for a walk. The forest was quiet and heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their bare limbs scratching at the gray sky. I followed a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the woods. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in fallen leaves that muffled my steps. After an hour, I stopped by a small creek. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I knelt down and cupped some in my hands to drink. The silence was almost complete here, broken only by the soft babble of the creek. For a moment, it felt peaceful. But as I looked up, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving just beyond the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, a deer maybe, or a trick of the light. I was alone, and my mind was probably playing games with me. I headed back to the cabin, trying not to think about it. That night was worse. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the cabin. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat close to the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Outside, something was moving. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, pressed into the soft earth around the cabin. The sounds circled, coming closer and then retreating. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer. But the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. They were too heavy, too steady, and they didn't stop. At one point, I caught a glimpse through the window. Something tall, too tall to be human, moving between the trees. I could barely make it out, but it had a strange, gangly shape. Its limbs looked too long and thin, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stepped back from the window, breathing hard. I didn't sleep that night. The fire died down and the cabin grew cold. The footsteps continued outside, circling and pacing. At one point, something scratched at the door. Sharp, deliberate claws tapping on the wood. I didn't open it. By dawn, the footsteps had stopped. The forest was still again. I sat by the window, watching the pale light spread across the trees. What the hell was out there? Over the next day, I tried to keep busy. I gathered firewood, fixed a loose floorboard, and made a small meal. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I stepped outside, I caught shadows just out of sight. The forest seemed darker, colder, and heavier, like it was holding its breath. That afternoon, I decided to explore a little further. I followed the creek downstream, hoping to find a better trail or maybe even a small road. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead. The forest floor was littered with broken twigs and crushed leaves, signs that something had passed through recently. Then I saw it. At the base of a large pine, there were strange marks, deep scratches gouged into the bark. The wood was raw and splintered, like claws had torn into it. I looked around, my stomach tightening. Nearby, the ground was disturbed. Patches of earth were dug up, as if something had been searching for food. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of small animals, the distant caw of a crow. But beneath it all was something darker, something watching, waiting. I turned back quickly, my pace quickening until I was running. The trees blurred past me, branches scraping at my jacket and face. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. That night, I barely ate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the cabin, waiting for me to slip up. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, half growl and half whimper, coming from the woods. It was close, too close. I froze, listening as the noise rose and fell. The sound was desperate, angry, and somehow backslash. Human, but twisted, distorted like it was coming from something broken. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy stick from the corner. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in pale white circles. The sound stopped. Then, a movement. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, I saw a figure step into the light. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were long and thin, like sticks, but the way it moved was wrong, too jerky, too awkward. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent. The face was gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed with a cold, empty light. Its mouth was open in a silent scream, revealing sharp, broken teeth. I stood frozen, unable to move or scream. The thing tilted its head, watching me like I was prey. It didn't run or attack. It just stared. I knew then what it was. The stories I'd heard, the warnings from locals about the Wendigo, or something like it. Creatures born from starvation and madness, twisted by the harshness of the wild. I didn't believe in monsters, but this was no myth. It was real. The thing took a slow step forward, cracking twigs under its feet. I swung the stick wildly, shouting, trying to scare it off. For a moment, it recoiled, then vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, clutching the stick, listening for the footsteps that never came. Morning brought a bitter cold. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't stop to eat or rest. The forest seemed to close in around me as I hurried down the trail toward the road. Halfway there, I stumbled over something in the leaves. I looked down. A torn piece of skin, pale and hairless, stretched thin over a jagged bone. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to throw up. Whatever had been out here, it was real, and it was hungry. When I reached my car, I slammed the door and locked it, starting the engine without hesitation. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest. The trees stood still, silent once more, but I knew it wasn't over. The Wendigo wasn't just a story. It was out there waiting for its next meal. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone what I saw, because who would believe me? A crazy person talking about monsters? But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps outside my window. Slow, heavy, and patient, waiting. It was late October, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and doesn't leave even when you're inside by the fire. I had been out at my hunting cabin for a few days, tucked deep in the woods where the trees were thick, and the only sounds were the wind through the pines and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The cabin was small, old but solid, built by the previous owner who'd used it mostly during deer season. I kept it simple: a wood stove, a bed, a small kitchen, and a few shelves with canned food and hunting gear. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. It was the perfect escape. The first few days were quiet, peaceful even. I woke early, drank coffee from the thermos, and spent my mornings walking the trails, scouting for signs of deer. The forest was dense, the ground damp from recent rains, and the colors of fall were starting to fade into the dull browns and grays of approaching winter. I enjoyed the silence, no phones, no cars, just nature. Nights were long and dark, but the wood stove kept me warm, and I had plenty of firewood stacked nearby. On the third night, things started to feel off. It was around 9 p.m. when I noticed it. I was sitting near the stove, reading an old hunting magazine under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves swirling across the porch. Then, just as I was about to turn the page, I heard a faint noise outside, something soft, like a scrape or a shuffle. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel digging through the fallen branches. I stood up and looked out the window facing the front porch. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the porch light's weak circle, I caught a glimpse of something moving low to the ground. It was quick, almost like it was crawling or slinking, but not like any animal I'd seen around these woods. Curious and a little uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharper than before, and the crunch of dead leaves underfoot sounded loud in the quiet. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the yard, focusing on where I'd seen the movement. That's when I saw it clearly. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen in the wild. It was skinny, almost unnaturally thin, with long limbs that bent in strange angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over what looked like knobby joints, and it moved with a kind of crawling motion that was more unsettling than anything I could describe. It wasn't running or walking. It seemed to drag itself forward using its elbows and knees, but the way it moved was too deliberate, too quiet. The face was the worst part. It was narrow and angular, with deep-set eyes that reflected the light of my flashlight with a dull, glassy shine. The nose was barely there, more like two small holes above a thin, lipless mouth. Its head tilted slightly as if studying me. I froze, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The creature didn't make a sound. It didn't blink or shift expression. It just stayed there, crouched low on the ground about 10 feet from the porch, watching me with those empty eyes. I swallowed hard and slowly backed inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it. For a moment, I sat on the floor, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was some kind of animal I'd never seen. A sick deer or a strange dog. But the shape, the way it moved, nothing fit. I kept the curtains closed, drew the blinds tight, and stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sound outside. I heard nothing but the wind and the creaking of the old cabin settling. The stove burned low, and the room grew cold, but I refused to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside carefully. There was no sign of the creature, no footprints, no broken branches, no claw marks. The ground looked untouched except for the usual scattered leaves and pine needles. I told myself it was a dream or a trick of the light. But that night, when the sun had dipped behind the trees and darkness fell again, I saw it return. This time it was closer. It crouched near the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing where I'd left a pile of firewood stacked neatly for the coming winter. It didn't move quickly, but its limbs stretched and pulled in those odd, jerky movements that made my skin crawl. The pale skin caught the moonlight peeking through the clouds, and I could see its ribs pressed against the thin flesh, making it look almost skeletal. I wanted to call out or make noise, but the sound stuck in my throat. I grabbed my hunting rifle from beside the door, the cold metal heavy in my hands. I pointed the flashlight at the creature, but it just watched. It didn't run, didn't hide, just stayed there, like it was waiting for something. I decided not to shoot. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't a normal animal, but also not a threat in the usual sense. I watched it for what felt like an hour, every minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, it turned and disappeared into the dark woods, moving the same crawling way until the trees swallowed it whole. For the next 2 days, I stayed mostly inside. I left the porch light on all night and kept a constant fire burning in the stove. I didn't hear it again, but I knew it was still out there. Something was watching me. On the 5th night, I woke to a sound at the window, a faint tapping, like nails scraping glass. My heart jumped, and I grabbed the rifle again, moving slowly toward the noise. The moon was high now, and I could see outside clearly. The creature was there, pressed close against the window pane, its eyes staring straight at me. It didn't move when I raised the rifle, didn't blink or react, just stayed still, as if it was waiting for me to do something. I lowered the gun slowly, feeling a strange mix of fear and pity. What was this thing? Why was it here? I left the window and sat back by the fire, feeling exhausted and tense. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. Whatever it wasn't like anything I'd faced before, and I wasn't sure I could handle another night like this. The next morning, I packed my gear quickly, keeping an eye on the woods the whole time. As I loaded my truck, I saw it one last time, the creature standing just at the tree line, watching. It didn't run when I approached, just stayed there, thin and silent. I got in the truck and started the engine, the noise loud in the still morning. As I drove away, the creature didn't move. It just stood there, a strange figure against the dark forest, until the trees swallowed it from view. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. I've told myself it was some kind of animal, maybe a rare disease or deformity, but something deep down tells me it was more than that. Something that doesn't belong in the world we know, something that watches and waits in the dark places where no one goes. Every time I think about it, I remember those hollow eyes and the way it moved, and I'm glad I got out when I did. Because some things, no matter how real they seem, are better left unseen. The road was barely more than a dirt path, covered with dry leaves and the occasional broken branch. I had been driving for hours, winding deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows that made the trees look like towering dark walls. I hadn't seen another car all day. The map on my phone had stopped working miles back, so I was relying on memory and the crude directions scribbled on a piece of paper. This was supposed to be a simple weekend escape, a cabin tucked far away from everything, a place to clear my head and be alone. But by the time I pulled up to the small gravel driveway, I already felt uneasy. The cabin sat just off the road, half hidden behind thick pines. It was old, weathered from years of rain and snow, the wood gray and cracked, but still solid. A thin column of smoke curled up from the chimney, suggesting the place was warm inside. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or more on edge. No one else was around. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of dust and damp wood. I flicked on the flashlight from my pack and scanned the room. There was a small living area with a worn sofa, a rusted wood stove, and a table cluttered with old magazines and a dusty lantern. The kitchen was tiny and bare except for a few cans on the shelf and an old, chipped sink. I dropped my bag and started looking for the fuse box to get the power on. The cabin was wired for electricity, but the lights didn't work yet. As I moved around, the wooden floorboards groaned under my weight. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, making the branches scrape softly against the cabin walls. The whole place felt like it was holding itself together by a thread. I set about starting a fire in the stove. The dry wood was easy to light, and soon the room was filled with the smell of burning pine and a soft orange glow. I sat back on the sofa, the heat washing over me, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I had brought enough food for 2 days: canned beans, a loaf of bread, some jerky, and a small bottle of water. The nearest town was miles away, and the cell signal was spotty at best. No one would check on me until Monday, which was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no people, just quiet. But quiet wasn't coming. After the fire was going strong, I decided to explore the property a bit. The cabin sat on a clearing about the size of a small yard, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks rough and covered with moss. The ground was soft with pine needles and fallen leaves, and small critters scurried at my feet. I walked to the edge of the clearing, peering into the shadows of the forest. The light was fading fast, and soon the darkness swallowed everything. I turned back to the cabin and saw movement near the tree-line. A flicker of something white, maybe a bird or a deer. It disappeared quickly, but the glimpse made my heart jump. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods doing what they do. That night, I lay in the old bed upstairs, listening to the sounds outside. The wind picked up, and the branches scratched against the cabin like nails on a chalkboard. Every now and then, I heard a crack or a thump, the unmistakable noise of something moving just beyond the window. My mind ran through all the logical possibilities: raccoons, deer, maybe a stray dog. Nothing dangerous. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed awake for hours, eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the shadows to reveal their secret. But nothing did. Morning came slowly. The sky was overcast, gray clouds blotting out the sun. I brewed coffee on the stove and sat by the window, sipping slowly. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, no hint of the eerie darkness from last night. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, stacking firewood, and gathering water from a small creek nearby. I made sure to stay close to the cabin and not wander too far. The isolation was calming, but also lonely in a way that made my skin crawl. Around mid-afternoon, as I was chopping wood, I heard a sound that made me freeze: footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the edge of the forest. I stopped, gripping the axe tightly, eyes darting toward the trees. The footsteps came closer, crunching over twigs and leaves. I couldn't see anything through the thick brush, but the noise was unmistakable. Someone or something was approaching. I backed toward the cabin, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped just at the tree-line, as if the person was waiting, watching me. I didn't want to turn around and see who it was. Instead, I hurried inside and locked the door, bolting the deadbolt with shaky hands. Inside, I checked the windows and closed all the curtains. The cabin felt smaller, suffocating somehow. I sat by the stove again, trying to calm down, but the feeling of eyes on me didn't leave. Hours passed. The footsteps never returned, but the unease stayed. I kept my phone close, hoping for a signal, but the screen only showed no service. The nearest neighbor was miles away. If whoever it was wanted to harm me, there was no one to hear my calls. That night, I left the fire burning low and sat near the door, a knife in my hand. Every little sound made me jump. A twig snapping, a gust of wind rattling the window, the distant call of a bird. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and careful, circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening as the sounds moved from one side to the other. The soft scrape of shoes on gravel. The occasional pause, like someone was trying to decide what to do. I grabbed my jacket and keys, quietly slipped out the back door, and slipped into the shadows of the trees. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The cold night air bit at my skin as I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face and arms. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto a narrow logging road. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a main road or a house. My breath was ragged, and my legs ached, but I kept going. The forest eventually thinned out, and faint lights appeared in the distance. A small cluster of houses, maybe a farm. I kept moving until I reached a porch where a man was sitting on a rocking chair. I told him about the cabin and the footsteps. Without hesitation, he called the local sheriff. The sheriff came with another officer, and together they returned to the cabin. They found no sign of anyone around, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. They said it was likely someone trying to scare me off, maybe local kids or hunters. I never went back to that cabin. The woods had shown me a side I didn't want to see, a place where the silence was broken by footsteps that didn't belong. I learned that some places are better left alone, and sometimes the scariest things are the people we don't see. I never thought a weekend alone in a remote cabin could turn into something like this. I had planned it for weeks. A quiet break from the noise of the city. No internet, no calls, just me and the woods. The cabin was nothing fancy. A small wooden structure tucked away near the edge of a thick forest. I found it listed online, owned by a guy who only rented it out when he wasn't using it. The pictures made it look cozy, with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a porch facing a clearing. I figured it was the perfect place to get some peace and right. The drive out was long but peaceful. The road narrowed into a dirt track that bounced and jostled the car, kicking up dust in the dry air. Pine trees lined both sides, growing so close their branches brushed the roof at points. I kept my windows down to let the fresh smell of the forest fill the car. As I got closer, I noticed fewer birds and less movement. Felt like the woods themselves were watching, waiting. When I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was dipping low, casting long orange shadows. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood, a porch with a creaky swing, and a stack of firewood neatly piled by the door. I grabbed my bags and stepped out. The air was cool and sharp, and I felt a sudden prick of unease. Maybe it was just the quiet. Out here, the silence isn't peaceful. It's thick, heavy, like something's holding its breath. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. I set down my bags and flicked on the small propane lantern. The light was weak, barely pushing back the shadows that gathered in the corners. I walked around, taking it all in. The kitchen was simple, a small fridge, a single burner stove, a metal sink. There was a table with 2 chairs and a tiny shelf filled with mismatched plates and cups. A couch covered with a faded plaid blanket sat near the wood stove. On the walls hung a few paintings of mountain scenes, faded and cracked. I unpacked my notebook and laptop, planning to write until dark. Outside, the wind rustled the pine needles, and I could hear the faint crackling of branches snapping somewhere deeper in the forest. I told myself it was probably deer or some small animal moving about. The first night passed with little incident, save for the usual noises of a forest. Owls calling, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog or coyote. I felt calm, almost soothed. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The clearing stretched about 50 yards before the thick trees swallowed everything in shadow. The forest floor was covered in dead leaves, pine needles, and patches of moss. The sun filtered through the branches, creating shifting patterns of light and dark. I found a narrow trail leading into the woods and followed it for a few hundred yards. The trail was faint, barely more than an animal path. Occasionally, I spotted broken branches or crushed ferns that told me something bigger had passed through recently. Returning to the cabin, I noticed the wind had picked up and the clouds were growing darker. I built a fire in the wood stove to warm the place and started to write again. The quiet outside was different now, heavier, like the forest had closed in tighter. At one point, I heard a sharp snap from outside, followed by a low rustle. I looked out the window but saw nothing except swaying trees. As evening fell, the wind became a steady howl, rattling the cabin's windows and shaking the porch swing. I felt small and exposed, surrounded by miles of dark forest. I kept the fire going, adding logs to keep the room bright and warm. It was then I noticed the first real sign that I wasn't alone. On the porch, just beyond the light cast by the lantern hanging by the door, I saw fresh footprints pressed deeply into the dirt. They were large, heavy prints like those of a man wearing heavy boots. But I hadn't seen anyone else come up the road, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. I stared at the prints, heart pounding, trying to make sense of them. They started at the edge of the clearing and stopped right at the porch. No prints leading away. Whoever was here had come close, too close, and not left. I checked every window, every door lock. Nothing was disturbed. The footprints looked recent, pressed into the soft earth no more than an hour ago. The night was the hardest. I sat by the stove with a knife I kept from my camping gear on the table in front of me. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, made me jump. The wind whipped and moaned like a living thing, making the walls shake. I kept glancing toward the porch, half expecting to see a figure standing just outside the door. But no one came. Sleep was impossible. I finally gave up and sat by the window, watching the dark forest. The fire was dying, and the cold was creeping in. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps outside, careful and slow, circling the cabin. My breath caught. The prints on the porch had been from earlier, but now something was moving again. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time closer to the back of the cabin. I couldn't see through the windows in the back. It was pitch black. I grabbed my flashlight and, with the door locked, stepped out on the porch to shine the beam into the trees. The light swept over the undergrowth but revealed nothing. Still, I could hear faint breathing, low and steady, just beyond the edge of the clearing. For hours, I stayed alert, flashlight in hand, listening as the footsteps moved slowly around the cabin, circling and retreating, circling and retreating. At one point, the breathing stopped, and a chilling silence fell. Then, without warning, a branch snapped somewhere to the north, breaking the quiet. I stayed on the porch, waiting for dawn. When the first light touched the treetops, I looked for signs of who had been stalking me through the night. There were fresh prints all around the cabin, some half hidden in the dirt and grass. The boots had come close enough to see the scuff marks on the sole. But there were no other signs, no dropped items, no voices, no fires. That morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, my hands trembling. On the drive back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or a figure on the road behind me. But the road was empty. When I got back to the city, I told myself it was probably some hunter or drifter who had been watching the cabin but decided not to approach. The experience left me rattled, but it was over. The cabin was just a quiet place, and the forest was wild, sometimes dangerous. Now, whenever I think about that weekend, the images of those boot prints and the sound of slow, careful footsteps circling the cabin come back to me. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, just someone or something real and close enough to touch but choosing to stay hidden. It was early October when I decided to take a break from the noise and constant rush of the city. I'd been feeling drained for months, and the idea of a quiet weekend alone in a cabin somewhere deep in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. I found a small cabin for rent, about 100 miles from town, nestled on the edge of a large national forest. The owner had warned me it was isolated, with no cell signal and the nearest neighbor miles away, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, no interruptions. The drive out there was long and winding. The road narrowed from paved asphalt to gravel, and eventually just dirt. Trees crowded in close on either side, their branches twisting and scraping against the windows when the wind picked up. The further I went, the quieter everything got. No cars, no planes, no distant hum of civilization. Only the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves. I told myself to enjoy the silence, but I also felt a growing weight of loneliness creeping in. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly what I expected. Small, weathered, with wood darkened from years of rain and sun. It sat on a slight rise overlooking a clearing filled with wild grasses and scattered boulders. The porch sagged a little, but the windows gleamed faintly from the late afternoon sun. I pulled up and parked, took a deep breath, and grabbed my bags. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp earth. It was simple, one room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The windows were big and let in a lot of light, but also made the room feel exposed. I unpacked slowly, lighting a few candles and stacking some firewood next to the stove. The owner had left a metal box with some matches and a small axe, just in case. I was used to camping, so I didn't worry. The first evening was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove and cooked some canned beans and rice over the flames. Outside, the sky darkened, and the forest around the cabin turned into a black wall of shadows. The sounds of the woods grew louder, the chirping of crickets, the crackling of dry leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I sat on the porch for a while, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the trees. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and earth. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. The unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin settling kept me alert. Every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I kept the fire going low and the candles lit until I finally drifted off. The next day, I woke up feeling tired but eager to explore. I had a small backpack with some snacks, water, and a map the owner had left. The forest was thick with tall pines and hardwoods. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, making my footsteps quiet. As I wandered deeper, I noticed the colors, reds, oranges, and yellows blending in with the evergreens. It was beautiful, but the solitude was heavy. I found a small stream that cut through the forest, its water clear and cold. I crouched down and drank, feeling the cold bite my lips. The sound of flowing water was comforting. I followed the stream for a while until it disappeared beneath a dense tangle of bushes. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched, though I saw nothing. Returning to the cabin just before dusk, I made another fire, this time bigger. I gathered dry twigs and branches from the clearing, careful not to stray too far into the woods. As the fire crackled, I noticed the wind picking up, whistling through the trees. The shadows around the cabin seemed to grow longer, deeper. That night, the sounds outside changed. The usual chorus of insects and birds gave way to something else. Heavy footsteps on dead leaves, the low grunt of an animal, the snapping of small branches. My mind tried to tell me it was just a deer or a raccoon, but the noises felt too deliberate, too close. I sat by the fire with my back to the wall, the axe within reach. The wind howled, and the cabin shook slightly, like it was being pushed. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the forest moving around me. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard a soft tapping at the window. I froze. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. I swallowed hard and slowly stood up, walking to the window with the axe raised. The candlelight flickered against the glass. Outside, Just beyond the porch light, I saw nothing but dark shapes of trees. I blinked and leaned closer. The tapping stopped. For a long minute, there was silence. Then the sound of something dragging across the dirt. Something big. My heart slammed in my chest. I backed away and grabbed my phone to check the time. No signal. I wasn't worried about that before, but now it felt like a trap. I kept the fire going strong and sat with the axe across my lap. Throughout the night, the noises never stopped. Footsteps circling the cabin, heavy breathing just outside the door, branches snapping under weight. Once or twice, I thought I saw shapes moving past the windows, just beyond the firelight. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening, watching, gripping the axe. Morning was a relief. The forest looked peaceful again in the light. I packed a small bag, knowing I wouldn't stay another night. I planned to drive back to town, even if it meant taking the long road. But when I stepped outside, I found something that froze my blood. The firewood pile was scattered and broken, like something had clawed through it. Deep scratches gouged the wood of the porch steps. Around the cabin, the earth was churned up with large, heavy prints. They were too big for any deer or bear I'd ever seen. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, noting more of these prints. They led into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I tried to stay calm. I grabbed my bags, locked the cabin door, and hurried to my car. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Between the trees, watching, was a huge dark shape. It didn't move when I looked directly at it. It just stood there, tall and silent, like it was waiting for me to leave. I didn't look back again. The road felt endless, but I finally reached the highway and the small towns with gas stations and people. The tension in my body slowly released. Later, when I told the cabin owner what happened, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Those woods," he said, "they're home to some big animals people don't see much. Black bears, maybe a big male cougar. They don't usually come close to cabins, but if something smells food or feels threatened, they'll check you out. You were lucky. Most people never see what's really out there." I didn't sleep well that night back in the city either, but for a different reason. The woods had shown me how close wildness still is, how thin the line is between solitude and being watched, how even in silence, something can be waiting. That weekend changed how I saw the forest. It wasn't just peaceful beauty. It was raw, dangerous, and completely alive, and I never went back to that cabin. I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of being alone, away from the noise of the city and the constant hum of daily life, felt like the perfect reset. I found an old cabin deep in the woods through an online rental site. Nothing fancy, just a small, weather-beaten place surrounded by thick pine trees, with a dirt road leading up to it. The photos showed a simple cabin with a stone chimney, a woodpile stacked outside, and windows covered in grime from years of neglect. Exactly what I wanted. When I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I parked my car near the cabin and grabbed my bags, the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked up the small porch steps. The cabin's wooden boards creaked slightly beneath my weight, and the door gave a faint groan as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. Dust motes floated in the beams of fading light that slipped through the grimy windows. The cabin was small, just one main room with a rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, a fireplace filled with cold ashes, and a single bed pushed into a corner. There was a tiny kitchen area with a rusted sink and a couple of cupboards. It felt like stepping back in time, or maybe like one of those old survival cabins I'd read about. I set my bags down and started to unpack, pulling out a lantern, some food, and a blanket. The plan was to spend 3 nights alone here, with nothing but the woods and my own thoughts. I didn't bring any phone signal, no internet, just the basics. I wanted to disconnect completely. The first evening was peaceful, almost serene. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, stacking the dry wood carefully and lighting it with matches. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. I sat back on the wooden chair, sipping some coffee I'd brought, feeling the warmth from the fire against my face. Outside, the woods were quiet except for the distant sound of a bird calling and the rustle of wind in the trees. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and kept the fire going, watching the dancing flames. The darkness beyond the windows felt vast and impenetrable, the trees standing like silent sentinels just beyond the glass. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting, but then I caught the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, heart thudding in my chest, listening carefully. The sounds were slow, deliberate, moving just past the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I grabbed the old hunting knife I'd brought and kept it close. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell again, heavy and complete, except for the crackling fire inside. After what felt like forever, I stood up and peered out the window. Nothing. The woods were black and still. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to sitting by the fire, but my mind wouldn't settle. The next day, I tried to focus on routine to keep my nerves steady. I chopped some wood for the fire, walked a little way down a narrow trail behind the cabin, and tried to distract myself by writing in a small notebook I'd brought. But the feeling of being watched never really left me. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, branches shaking, shadows shifting, only to find nothing there when I looked directly. Late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. Near the back door, there were small footprints pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't animal tracks, they looked like someone's boots. They led from the tree line right up to the cabin, then stopped abruptly at the doorstep. My stomach tightened. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, all seemed secure. There was no sign anyone had tried to break in. Still, the footprints were there, fresh. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the trees made me jump. I stayed close to the fire, and when it burned low, I added more wood despite the late hour. I even took the knife to bed with me, wedging it under my pillow. In the early hours, I heard footsteps again, this time louder, more confident. They circled the cabin slowly, then stopped at the back door. I didn't move, afraid to even breathe. Then, after a long pause, the footsteps retreated back into the woods. The next morning, the footprints were deeper and more numerous. Someone had spent hours around the cabin. By the third day, the feeling of being watched had turned into something heavier, an unmistakable sense of danger. I knew I wasn't just imagining it. Someone was out there, close enough to make a move at any time. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I saw the tracks again. This time going from the woods all the way to the edge of the dirt road where I'd parked. It was clear whoever was stalking the cabin was watching the road, maybe waiting for me. I didn't want to stay and find out what would happen next. I locked up the cabin tightly, got in my car, and drove away without looking back. Later, I learned from the local ranger that the area had seen a few break-ins and robberies in recent months, all targeting isolated cabins like mine. Some had ended badly. I was lucky, but I knew I'd never forget that feeling of being so close to something unknown, something human but utterly frightening. The woods were quiet again now, but that night I left, the darkness wasn't empty at all. The forest was thick, dark, and silent except for the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots as I made my way to the cabin. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping low behind the dense trees, casting long shadows that reached out like fingers across the uneven ground. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a chance to get away from everything, to be alone in the woods with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional bird call. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the cabin my uncle had left me last year. The cabin sat nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. It was old, built more than 50 years ago, but sturdy. Weather-beaten logs, some of them split or warped, formed the walls. The roof sagged a little on one side, but it kept the rain out. I had spent last summer repairing some of the rotting boards and cleaning up the inside. The place had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove for heat and a well outside for water. It was simple, but it was mine. As I stepped up to the porch, the wooden boards creaked under my weight. I pushed open the heavy door and let myself inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine needles and old smoke. Dust hung in the sunlight streaming through the grimy windows. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table and 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, and a small metal cabinet for supplies. I set my pack down and took a deep breath, feeling the stillness settle over me. I spent the next hour getting a fire going in the stove, stacking dry wood carefully and lighting kindling until the flames caught and began to glow warmly. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending small branches tapping against the roof. I pulled a blanket over my shoulders and sat by the fire, watching the orange flicker light up the cabin's shadows. The plan was simple. I would spend the night here alone. The next day, I'd hike a few miles down the trail to the lake and spend some time fishing before heading back to town. I had food packed, canned beans, some bread, and a few apples, enough to last the night and the morning. As darkness settled, the woods around the cabin came alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals. I could hear owls hooting in the distance and the sharp call of a fox nearby. The wind whispered through the trees like a low voice, never quite steady, always shifting. I stayed close to the fire, not because I was cold, but because the light felt safer. I had just settled in with a can of beans when I noticed something outside the window. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement between the trees. I froze, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other harmless creature. But then I saw it again, a figure standing still just beyond the clearing, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was too tall and too straight to be an animal. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the wind moving branches, or a play of shadows on the dark forest floor. Still, my heart started to beat faster. I closed the curtains and locked the door, though I knew it was more for my own peace of mind than actual protection. I went back to the fire and sat down, trying to focus on the warmth and the sound of the crackling wood. Minutes stretched by slowly, each one dragging me deeper into the quiet night. Then, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking just outside the cabin. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped the edge of the table and slowly stood up, peering through a small gap in the curtains. The clearing was empty, but I could see footprints in the dirt and leaves. Fresh ones, leading up to the porch and stopping just short of the door. Fear pressed against my chest, tight and heavy. I backed away from the window, scanning the room for something to defend myself with. The only thing close was a heavy iron poker I used for the stove. Outside, the footsteps crunched again, moving away from the porch, deeper into the trees. My breath came in short gasps. I stayed still for what felt like hours, listening. The wind was calm now, the forest eerily quiet. Just when I began to convince myself it was over, a soft knock came at the door. Not hard, not demanding, but deliberate and slow. I didn't move. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I gripped the poker tightly, heart pounding, and moved toward the door. I could see the faint outline of someone standing just beyond the porch light's reach. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person. I whispered to myself to stay calm. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone in trouble. But the thought didn't ease the fear inside me. The knocking stopped. I waited, breath held, but nothing else happened. No footsteps running away, no voices calling out, just silence. I backed away from the door and locked it again. Then I sat down, knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the sun to rise. The night crawled on. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustling of leaves, sent jolts through my body. I wanted to leave, to run into the forest and escape, but I knew it was the worst place to go in the dark. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilling over the trees, I dared to look outside. The footprints were gone. No sign of the figure, no other tracks. I packed up my things quickly, started a small fire to burn some trash, and made sure everything was locked and secured before stepping onto the porch. The forest was quiet again, peaceful almost. The sun warmed the air and chased away the shadows. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly ease. I had survived the night, alone in the cabin, facing whatever had been out there. And now I was going to leave, go back to the safety of the town and the people who knew me. The walk back through the woods was long, but every step felt lighter. When I finally reached the road, I looked back once, seeing the cabin standing silent and still among the trees. It wasn't just an old building in the forest anymore. It was a place where I had faced fear and stayed strong. A place that, despite everything, still belonged to me. And I knew I would come back again. But next time, I'd bring company. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing," I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened, No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again.